Without further ado, I think we should be ready to begin with our first session on synthetic media and parliamentarians understanding the threats as public figures. Really, the aim of this session is to provide some guidance on how to categorize and conceptualize the threats posed by generative AI and synthetic media, terms which those who have been in attendance the past few days will have, I hope, developed a strong understanding of. And even if you didn't attend those 2 days, I think these conversations today should again provide a solid background nonetheless. Really, the threats posed by these technologies to public figures in democracies, and in particular during the spate of quite high-profile elections we have scheduled for next year. So I think a very timely discussion. As mentioned, we have an incredible lineup across the day, including this session. Delighted to be joined by the Honourable Ray Abella from the Parliament of Malta and also Parliamentary Assembly of the Mediterranean, and also Professor Alexander Evans, OBE, Professor in Practice at the London School of Economics, and really looking forward to the conversation we'll be having with both of you. But just to start, we do have some pre-recorded remarks from Ms. Marietje Schaake. So we'll be playing those very shortly. Marietje is International Policy Director at Stanford University, and more specifically Stanford University's Cyber Policy Center, and International Policy Fellow at Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. Between 2009 and 2019, she served as a member of European Parliament for the Dutch Liberal Democratic Party, where she focused on trade, foreign affairs, and technology policies. She writes a monthly column for the Financial Times and serves on the UN's AI advisory body. Marietje is also a board member with a number of non-profits, including the European Council on Foreign Relations, the Observer Research Foundation, and Access Now. As I say, these are pre-recorded remarks. Just bear with me for 30 seconds whilst I just try and find it and share it.
Hello, my name is Marietje Schaake. I usually work at Stanford as a tech policy expert, and I would have loved to join you for your discussions around the role of parliaments in governing artificial intelligence, and particularly avoiding harms around disinformation, manipulation of elections and democracy. It is a topic close to my heart, but as you might be able to glance from the background here, I'm currently in Singapore for a conference also on AI governance, because it is a hot topic that people are talking about around the world. But let me share a few thoughts with you, and hopefully that will be a ground for discussion and further research so that you can better play your roles in protecting your electoral systems, the public debate, and public policy. So quite a bit of discussion can be found around how artificial intelligence, and in particular synthetic media that can be generated with generative AI, can be instrumentalized to manipulate the online sphere, where most people find news and information about politics and elections. And this is obviously a great area of concern, where a delicate balance is to be found between both seeing the problem for what it is, but also avoiding overstating the impact that AI might have. Because if people are to believe that nothing can be trusted anymore, that they can't believe their own eyes and any image or any text might be manipulated, then that in and of itself erodes the trust in media and institutions and the democratic process, and that would also be undesirable. There are some hopeful signs that new technologies like watermarking can help people differentiate between authentic and inauthentic statements, but the technology space is in full development, and as always, there is a sort of cat and mouse game between those who want to do harm and those who want to protect and make sure that the democratic process is fair. But I want to shift your attention to what I believe is the underpinning problem of some of the phenomena that we see in curating information, looking at how much risk and experimentation is acceptable with these new models such as generative AI that are really pushed into society for greater engagement, because our engagement with these models helps the companies train the models. So whereas from a public policy point of view, we might want to avoid such risk and experimentation, companies are incentivized to actually push the products to market, not only for our engagement with them, but also to be faster than their competitors. So what I'm trying to say is that the incentives are not aligned. And what AI as a field shows is the incredible power concentration in the hands of a couple of companies. This was already the case when we look at tech, big tech, the companies that have the data, that have the compute, that have the capital to really build out these new large language models, generative AI applications, and other AI applications. So it is a market that is even further concentrating, where that was already the case. And to me, the privatization of governance, the leaking of agency, knowledge, insight, and really the ability to do your jobs as parliamentarians, my former job, so I really empathize with the importance of your mandates, is kind of being stolen from you. There's really a silent coup going on where companies, tech companies, decide over more and more aspects of our lives. And that ranges from curating information on social media, as I mentioned, but also building digital critical infrastructure, scanning for risk on it, providing cybersecurity solutions, and really playing an increased role in the battlefield. We only need to look at the war in Ukraine, but also in Gaza, to see how tech companies, whether it's satellite companies or whether it is other tech companies like AI companies that are trying out or deploying their products, play a role. And in some cases, we can really see how the monopoly of power and responsibilities that used to lie in the hands of states, public institutions with public mandates, public accountability, are leaking to the private sector where there's no such oversight in place. And so if you really ask me what is the key problem with artificial intelligence and democracy, it is governance to me. It is not the incidental and specific use around disinformation and elections, even though I do think that is incredibly important, but it is a much more systemic problem that I hope you will be able to address in your discussions going forward, and that I also hope that you will offer perspective on as public leaders representing your constituents and communities and having to work for the greater good of all. So let me leave you with that. And again, apologize for not being with you in a more direct engagement because of time differences and my traveling around the world. If there's anything I can follow up with or that I can help to do to inform your work, don't hesitate to reach out. I curate a newsletter called Tech Policy Watch, which if you're interested to receive, you can send me a quick email. Hopefully the organizers can share that. And we have a lot of other resources at Stanford that are specifically catered to policymakers. We do policy briefs, we do webinars. We're very directly involved in trying to unlock the details about AI as a technology to provide greater understanding for you, decision makers, in how to deal with this whole field, because without a proper understanding of how these systems work, it is pretty difficult to make the right proposals and decisions about how to govern them. So I invite you to have a look, to engage, and I look forward to hearing from you and wish you a wonderful discussion going forward.
Our enormous thanks to Marietje for those pre-recorded remarks, and I think it's really important to emphasize those weren't just that wasn't just rhetoric from Marietje. There was a pretty direct call to action to parliamentarians, to elected officials, to engage with this and try and protect their mandate and ensure that they are part of the movement to regulate, maintain governance over some of this emerging technology, and also that invitation to collaborate. I'm sure a lot of ears perked up when she mentioned getting in touch with her, getting in touch with her office at Stanford to engage on these topics. And absolutely, I'll be dropping her email address later in this session into the chat function. So please do take her up on the offer of collaboration. I think that was a very generous offer, and again, great that it wasn't just rhetoric from Marietje, a very direct invitation and call to action to our stakeholders, which we absolutely love to see. So now I've already given a very brief introduction to our two live panelists who are joining us for the roundtable discussion section of this session, the Honourable Ray Abella and also Professor Alexander Evans. I'll give a bit of an introduction to each of them, but I'll maybe also hand over to them once I'm done to add anything they might want to add. I know they've got astonishing CV, so again, very, very grateful for their participation and giving us their time. So if I might start with the Honourable Abella. As I briefly mentioned, Honourable Abella is a member of the Parliament of Malta from the Labour Party. He was elected to Parliament in the 2022 Maltese general elections from District 3, which is in the south of Malta. Honourable Abella is best known as a television and education personality for the past 25 years and is also an expert and educator in the field of digital technology. For the last 35 years, he's been pushing forward the importance of learning in the use of digital lifestyles, e-governance and ICT education among all generations. Since his role in Parliament, Honourable Abella has participated in a number of discussions in Parliament and also in a number of parliamentary committees, legal frameworks and strategies. He is versatile and extensive experience in business, education, IT and innovation has prompted him to be part of many interventions in Parliament and international conferences focusing on e-health, education, the digital economy, e-governance, small and medium enterprises, skills in the economy and innovative technologies. Honourable Abella is a graduate with an MBA, and Honourable Abella, again, thank you so much for joining us. Professor Evans, OBE, is a professor in practice at London School of Economics, and his previous academic posts have included being the Henry Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress, a senior fellow at Yale University, and a Gwilym Gibbon Fellow at Nuffield College at the University of Oxford. He has a PhD in politics from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. A career diplomat, he has worked as an advisor to the Prime Minister in 10 Downing Street, as strategy director in the Cabinet Office, and as director of cyber in the Foreign Office. He has served as deputy and acting High Commissioner to both India and Pakistan, separately I should say, and led the United Nations Security Council expert group on Daesh, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and has been a senior advisor to Ambassador Richard Holbrooke in the US State Department. Professor Evans's OBE was awarded for his work in Pakistan, where he led the UK's work on the tribal areas from 2007 to 2009. I'm sure everybody else in this conference are equally as impressed as I am with both Honourable Abella and Professor Evans's CVs. I don't know if either of you want to add something, maybe something I missed, but also I wanted to give an opportunity to maybe introduce yourselves in your own words. So maybe we'll start with you, Professor Evans.
James, thanks very much for having me and knowingly under-introduced, so appreciate that generous introduction as well. Look, just very good to be here and thanks to all joining for giving up an hour of your life you will never get back. I just wanted to perhaps say one thing to frame, perhaps frame the discussion a little bit, which is just to sort of offer a note of dissent, but also agreement with Marietje. So, I mean, I agree that governance is probably one of the key issues that we're going to be thinking about, that we're going to have to grapple with going forward. But I would argue states and parliamentary sovereignty trump companies, no matter how big they are. And that's really because of the power of states, the power of state regulation. So I would just offer a sort of slightly different tone on the relative power. It's not to challenge the arguments that Marietje put forward, which I think are right, about over-concentration of the market and the fact that a lot of the activity is done by private companies.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And Honourable Abella, I don't know if you want to also just add some framing remarks, introductory remarks to yourself.
Thank you. First and foremost, good morning or good afternoon to you all colleagues there. Being a politician and a parliamentarian and also a technology expert as well as an IT educator presents a unique opportunity for me to shape up politics and discussion that bridge the gap between governance, communities, technologies, and education. It allows for the implementation of innovative solutions, improved efficiency, and informed decision-making, more especially on the advancements and also on the threats that the technology offers in our societies. During this session, I will take you in some key facts that we as politicians, being the subject we're discussing today, are exposed in this digital world. Today, I will speak about synthetic media, also known as deepfakes, which poses a significant threat to parliamentarians and public figures worldwide. Rapidly evolving technologies use artificial intelligence to manipulate or generate audio, video, and other content that can be distinguished from reality. So much accuracy, so much detail, as if we are experiencing the real thing. Just, for example, last month, United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, was actually presented with a video of himself speaking perfectly in Chinese, all AI generated. Mr. Guterres explained how he had this real experience of watching himself deliver a speech in flawless Chinese, despite the fact that he doesn't speak Chinese. His lips movements corresponded exactly to what he was saying. This is just one vivid example of the incredible possibilities and the potential dangers of AI today. Over the past years, we used to speak about the hazards exposed through the internet, through the communications and sharing of sensitive and personal data over the internet. At that time, we referred these threats coming through malware, phishing, identity theft, as much we do encounter these on our social media platforms, and that include online scams, ransomware, online predators, cyberbullying, fake news, and more. We speak constantly about cybercrime and the lack of privacy in this digital age. This mix of digital phenomenon advancements will continue to rise. Progress and digitalization and data harvesting everywhere, especially on cloud, has led to the systematic use and manipulation of such data mining through AI nowadays. This is the next step forward in digitalization. The more we have data, the more accurate artificial intelligence will become. Artificial intelligence plays a significant role in influencing and shaping future decisions across various domains. The impact of AI on decision-making is multifaceted and extends to areas such as business, healthcare, finance, education, politics, and even more. We will soon be experiencing the chipping of humans, for example, for health reasons. Implantable microchips or devices will be installed in our bodies that will remotely transmit data, which will provide continuous monitoring of various health parameters. These are challenging times globally, and AI could power extraordinary progress for humanity in any sector and not just health and technology. The transformative potential of AI and the next generation of Internet of Things is hard to even grasp or predict. AI will have a global transformation about our decisions for the next 20 years. And as much Internet was such an impact on humanity for the past 30 years. But how could AI be of threat to politicians, which is the subject of today? Synthetic media pose a very serious threat as they can be used in misinformation campaigns for political manipulation and to erode public trust in the political process and public institutions. It can maliciously influence political campaigns, and voters. To understand and address these threats, public figures like politicians like us and parliamentarians should consider the following strategies for actions. Important public awareness. We and all as public figures should educate themselves and their constituents about the existence of synthetic media and its potential threats. Raising awareness about the technology's capabilities can help people become more informative with the way they consume news from different media. Authentication and verification. Develop and promote robust authentication and verification processes for all media content. Encourage the use of trusted platforms and ensure that people can easily distinguish between genuine and manipulated media. Cybersecurity measures is another important aspect. We should invest in stronger cybersecurity measures to protect our personal information and digital identities. This includes using secure communication channels, regularly updating passcodes and passwords, and being cautious about sharing sensitive data. We parliamentarians have a strong responsibility. We must also be aware and be vigilant of hidden identities and deal with the profiles that we communicate with greater and greater attention. Legal frameworks are important too. While ensuring safeguard of freedom of expression, new legislative frameworks that address the creation and dissemination of deepfakes must be advocated for. These may include regulations related to content creation, distribution, and penalties for malicious use of synthetic media. Another aspect would be proactive communication. Be prepared, we politicians, we parliamentarians.
Many thanks, Honourable Bell. I'm just conscious that we do have the roundtable discussion that we're hoping to have, and we also have a number of sessions lined up in quite a tight schedule. So I'm just going to have to just cut off the presentation there. We have only 18 minutes left of this session and a number of questions that we're hoping to discuss more in that roundtable format. But I think everything that you mentioned is highly pertinent to all those stakeholders joining us. So perhaps if you're happy to share some of your remarks in soft copy, we can absolutely forward those on to those in attendance. But again, I'm just conscious that we have the roundtable component and also bringing Professor Evans back into the conversation, and again, to just encourage some people to ask their own questions and make this maybe a little bit more interactive. But thank you so much for the comments you've given thus far. We do enormously appreciate those, and I think maybe some of my questions will pick up on some of those elements that you were already discussing. In terms of talking about threats to public figures, and maybe to start again sort of a bit of a framing exercise, and also picking up on some of what Marietta said in her opening remarks about eroding what's understood as real and not real. When it comes to things like deepfakes and synthetic media, some argue that all we're seeing is the latest in a long history of political satire, political commentary. Is this just the latest evolution in that? Or is there something a bit more sinister and more concerning at play in terms of deepfakes and the power of generative AI to distort what is real and what is not? And how concerned should we be on the eve of what is, as I previously mentioned, an election-packed 2024? And maybe I'll come back to Professor Evans to give some initial thoughts on that.
Thanks very much, and you know, very much agree with the comments that Honourable Ray Abella just made as well. I mean, you know, thoughtful issues there, but we need to focus on. Look, you know, my view on this, James, a little bit is actually some of it is old. You know, satire, what Donald Rumsfeld, the famous philosopher, once called truthiness, stuff that appears to be true but isn't quite true. The character assassination and attacks on individual politicians. This runs back hundreds of years and has a long tradition in political cartoons, in underground newsletters, and other forms of attack. And indeed, in some of those early stages of satire, sometimes the satirical cartoon version of a politician was better known to the population at large than the actual politician themselves. So it's important for us to reach back into history. That having been said, there are three things I think that are quite profoundly different as we look forward, James. One of those is what you've alluded to and what Maricha was saying as well, which is we've moved into a much more siloed public domain in politics. We read and consume things that we agree with, or things that outrage us and further move us into our silos. There isn't really much of a consumption now of media that crosses political divides. So we're all inhabiting subreddits rather than inhabiting spaces of collective engagement, collective discussion, and potentially collective truth. So the silos and the implication of silos is new and is different to what went on before. And the second thing is what, most of the sharing of this content, if we roll back 50 years, if we roll back 200 years, was largely in the public domain. It was in newsletters, it was in pamphlets, it was in stuff that was circulated on the streets, it was in, pasted up on the walls, be it the walls of Valletta or the walls of London. And now, actually, it's not just about what goes on social media that we can access, X, potentially public Facebook groups, public Instagram accounts. It's about peer-to-peer sharing in forums like WhatsApp, which is much less accessible to the state or to regulators. So that, I think, that peer-to-peer angle is different because it's at scale. And the third thing, which I think is perhaps the most corrosive thing of all, and this is perhaps in some ways, to my mind, almost more important than the question of deepfakes, is digital persistence. When I grew up, I was the last generation, I'm 49, I'm the last generation that grew up in an analog world as we transited into a fully digital world. What I did at the age of 17 hasn't been captured on video, it wasn't shared on social media, and it can't necessarily be used against me in my contemporary life. For politicians of today and tomorrow, the digital persistence in their lives, I think, frames risk and the risk of character assassination very, very differently. And my worry here is less about deepfakes, although I think we should be worried about that in time, but it's a way in which AI, the way in which technology can be used to frame, recover, and present that material and test it with users. So picture the scene, you have an attack bit of content that's been generated through generative AI, but draws on facts on the record rather than deepfakes about a politician, and that content is tested against lots of user groups to see who will respond most actively to that material, and then that material is used in a campaign. So that's the angle I think, James, that I would be most concerned about, but it does feel new.
Great, thanks, Alexander. That's I think a number of really important points there, and absolutely agree on the silos and echo chambers and the threat of confirmation bias and a few other issues that come with that. And I think that really speaks to one of the presentations we had on Monday by Cassidy Bereskin, when she was talking about confirmation bias and the issue of online echo chambers and sort of reinforcement bias, which I know she also mentions in our handbook that we've recently published with the OAS on AI, disinformation and synthetic media, which again we'd encourage all of our attendees to have a look at and download and read. Honourable Abella, I'd like to come back to yourself with the same question about how we should frame this threat. Is it an extension of historical satire, or is this an entirely new paradigm that we're looking at? And if I could just again ask you to unmute yourself. Thank you very much. So if colleagues in Valletta could just again unmute the technology, that'd be much appreciated. Thank you very much. Just give it a few seconds. As soon as the icon disappears, hopefully we'll be able to hear you, Honourable Abella. Still not quite audible. No, we can't quite hear you. So maybe I'll start to pick up a little bit on what you've already mentioned, Alexandra, then maybe we can come back to Honourable Abella for his thoughts on the first question. And again, looking at generative AI at the moment, and again, trying to frame and conceptualize risks. We now have things, words that have new meanings, and also entirely new words. I think actually the word of the year, according to, I think, the Oxford English Dictionary, was hallucinations, because we now have this new meaning of the word hallucinations. We also have this idea of Franken people. And this is really where AI tools such as large language models are generating information based on incomplete information, maybe slightly shoddy data, and maybe it is reinforced by certain biases, certain groups of people working on this AI. And these issues can arise without the need for malicious intentions or bad intentions, but arise nonetheless and do carry a very human element in terms of reputational risk to public figures and to others. So how should we conceptualize a threat that has those human elements in terms of the risk and the impacts, but is entirely synthetic? It doesn't necessarily involve human actors or agency to cause those hallucinations. So how should we conceptualize those threats? And I'll come to you, Professor Evans.
James, I'm happy to have a go at that. I mean, a bit of it. I do think we need to sometimes sort of stem our excitement a little bit, because this is AI, generative AI. It is material. It is going to be transformative, but we're in a little bit of a moment of excitement and anticipation right now. So it's the dinner party conversation everywhere, from Brooklyn to Lagos to Canberra. But it's conversation largely by uninformed commentators. So you know, and you're still talking at the moment about human commissioning of work by these models. So you know, for stuff to be generated, for stuff to be created, it's got to be a human who's actually asking for it to be created, and it's probably got to be human who's trying to bring it into a political campaign or using it to assassinate a character in politics. I would just say, you know, what is different here is, like, you know, some questions that it throws up for me is about balance in political campaigns, for example. So for political candidates, are you in an analog party or are you in a digital party? In some of the countries in which I've worked, the unbalance between political campaigns is very evident. And you know, there is, I would argue, a systemic advantage for parties that are able to mobilize, pay for, and properly test digital campaigning tools. The element I'd be more concerned about than synthetic video, it's quite difficult to do synthetic video at the moment, because it's difficult to break through the uncanny valley, something feeling a little bit wrong about it, feeling a little bit fake about it. It is, however, much more plausible to do synthetic speech. So I would be concerned about synthetic voice recordings being used, and in particular, being used in a way that's very familiar to malign political campaigning or just generalized political campaigning that we've seen in election campaigns around the world, which is you drop content just before the polls close. You drop content just before the polls close. So it's too late. It doesn't matter about the forensics after the event. It doesn't matter about the corrections. It doesn't matter about material being withdrawn, because if it's in circulation for that 24-hour to 72-hour period before polls open, it can be profoundly damaging to a candidate.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alexandra. And I know that a few presenters over the past few days have highlighted an example of that, the audio synthetic voice recordings that we saw in the UK on the eve of one of the parties' conferences, and yeah, how that went viral. But once it's out there, it's out there. So yeah, maybe we do need to temper our excitement and then maybe the more science fiction elements of these conversations, and remember that there is still that human agency. So Honourable Abella, I think you are now unmuted, so happy to come back to yourself for your contributions.
Sorry for that. No, I agree with Professor Alexander Evans regarding the way that that marketing and information has evolved across the years. Not much before when we have the phenomenon of internet present in our lives. But, you know, I mean, the twist in manipulating information and data, it always existed from the age of printed media and the conventional marketing. Obviously, towards the social media that we have today, it goes faster. The information goes faster. I mean, the use of conventional newspapers, printed newspapers nowadays, they are being over with digital media and digital news that runs much faster on the social media, and even through browsers as well that eventually can seek for information on any public figure, politician or parliamentarian. But today we're talking about this big data issue. We're facing this big data issue where this analysis of this big data being done through AI could eventually propose a greater threat for the information and misinformation on politicians, parliamentarians, and public figures, and anyone in general. So, yes, I see this that's going to be an even more going to be further threat about the situation as the technology evolves.
Thank you very much, Honourable Abella. And maybe I'll just pick up on that last point and ask my final question, while still trying to temper too much excitement about AI, but also remaining cognizant of some of the threats and some of the risks. And when it comes to the current capabilities of the various forms of synthetic media, deepfakes, but also synthetic voice recordings, multimedia tools, conscious this is as rudimentary as it's ever going to be. This, some of the deepfakes we see, the technology is only going to get better. And as we get increasingly capable and powerful tools, do you see a situation where the innovations to counter the malicious use of synthetic media will catch up? Or do you think we need to accept that we'll always be playing catch up with the tools to create ever more convincing synthetic media? Do you think it's always going to be that cat and mouse, or do you think we can reach a stage where it is an equal playing field, for lack of a better term? And I'll come back to Professor Evans for that.
James, thanks. I mean, I would very quickly say that, my sense historically, both governments and political parties have tended to be fast followers rather than necessarily innovators. So political campaigns have borrowed from the customer analytics and individual segmentation that large companies have done. And governments have tended to adopt technologies that have already been used by private sector or other actors. So I don't think we should be worried necessarily about the fact that probably inevitably we'll be doing fast following rather than innovating in advance. Marietta mentioned something I think that does have some degree of promise, but it's still early days, which is what could you do around digital watermarking? But even watermarks can be faked. Look at the long history of fake currency, for example. I would pick really probably three things to think about as we go forward. The first is the crucial importance of having digital forensics capability in government, or accessible to government from the private sector, so that at least after an event, there is the ability to really dig in, understand what happened, understand who was responsible, and diagnose and, where possible, attribute responsibility. The second is around regulation. I think there is a role here for regulators even in this fast-moving, fast-changing, volatile space. And that's obviously crucially important for electoral commissions, for election commissions and electoral regulators, but also actually for telecoms and digital media regulators. And finally, there's something here about imagination. Governments aren't always very good at imagination either, and we may not be able to anticipate or get ahead always of the evolution of generative AI and what that means for electoral politics, what it means for deepfakes, for disinformation. But we can scenario plan, we can horizon scan, we can use our imaginations to at least conceptualize what some of the challenges what might be and what we could do about them.
Brilliant, thanks, Professor Evans. Yeah, and to go back to the watermarking and the promises around that, we did have some of the big players involved in the C2PA join us yesterday, and I know there are conversations around whether you're trying to pursue transparency, whether you're trying to build trust, whether you can ever really force somebody to trust something, and who are the various actors who you feel you can trust. And yeah, I think the issue of horizon scanning and the imagination of governments, and yeah, I think the idea of fast following, as you called it, is yeah, quite prescient. So I'll just give some time also to Honourable Ray Bella to just give some of his thoughts to that final question. So Honourable Bella, over to you.
Yes, I'm sure, as I said, the threats will advance, but obviously the counter combatment when it comes to large corporations like Microsoft Video Authenticator, which is a suitable kind of application that designed to analyze videos and provide confidence score indicating the likelihood of the manipulation, and other forms like deepware scanners. These applications, these software will help us determine and do the necessary digital forensics to understand whether there are deep fakes or anything of this sort on the material that is uploaded on the web.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Honourable Bella, and also thank you to Professor Evans. I see that we're now at time. I think we could have had another 45 minutes conversation on this. I think this, as I suggested in my opening remarks, this did indeed build on the previous day's sessions, whilst also, if anyone wasn't able to join us the past 2 days, I think it still provided a good grounding in some of these technologies that we're talking about. So just to say enormous thanks to you both. Many thanks again also to Marietta for her pre-recorded remarks. I think this was enormously valuable. You are both, of course, welcome to stay for the following sessions. We still have another 2 hours and 10 minutes of sessions today. So if you're interested, please do stay on the call. We just ask you to mute yourselves and turn your cameras off. But yeah, please do feel free to stay. I think I've seen that both of our speakers for our next session are already on the call. They're already here. So that's fantastic. We should be able to move quite swiftly on to our session on synthetic media and human rights, building a rights-based approach. So maybe I'll just invite both of those speakers to turn their cameras on, and also perhaps to unmute themselves. Louis and Professor Ifeanyi Ejiofor, welcome to you both, and thank you so much for committing your time to us. Enormously appreciated. So this session is intended to invite attendees to consider the value of taking a rights-based approach to regulating generative AI and the specific risks to individual rights posed by increasingly capable and available generative AI, including synthetic media such as deepfakes that we were discussing in the previous session. So again, I've mentioned it multiple times now. Today we have really outstanding high-level speakers, and maybe again I'll allow the speakers to add anything they want to after I've introduced them. But again, I'll provide a brief introduction to them. So firstly, Professor Nnenye Ifeanyi Ejiofor, who is Professor of Law and Technology at Leeds Law School at Leeds Beckett University. She's also a Technology and Human Rights Fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University and an Associate Fellow of the Africa Program at Chatham House. Her teaching and research interests focus primarily on the intersection of law and technology, especially the governance of digital technologies, digital rights, and the rule of law in cyberspace. She is the chair of the Cybercrime Working Group of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise and the vice chairperson of the Africa Union Cybersecurity Experts Group, and has been actively involved in advising the Africa Union Commission and African member states on existing international, regional, and national legal frameworks related to cybersecurity, whilst also promoting cybersecurity across the region. She serves as the Africa Union delegate to the United Nations Ad Hoc Committee to elaborate a comprehensive international convention on countering the use of information and communications technologies for criminal purposes. Even by United Nations standards, I think that's quite a long title, and the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group on ICTs. Professor Ifeanyi Ejufo, enormous welcome to you, and again, delighted to have you join us. And our second speaker is Louis Mainga, Program Communications Coordinator at Witness Africa. Louis uses various regimes of communications towards one common goal, and that is to amplify resources and make them accessible to activists and human rights defenders using video to expose the truth and advance accountability for human rights violations. Prior to joining Witness, Louis worked for Malaria No More as a digital strategist for Kenya, elevating advocacy efforts against malaria in online spaces in Kenya, an effort which attracted the attention of key global figures and organizations. Aware that a world that respects human rights can spring forward on many fronts, Louis is committed to helping achieve social justice at community levels. In 2015, he led the student team that pioneered the Human Rights Club at the Center for Human Rights at Laikipia University in Kenya. And in 2016, together with 6 other former university colleagues, he co-founded RAN Initiative, a community-based organization that sought to build basic human rights awareness in Kenya. So 2 amazing panelists who, again, very, very grateful to have you joining us. I'm sure you'll be providing amazing insights. And I want to hand over to the first of our panelists to present some opening remarks and maybe also to provide their own introduction to themselves. I never want to speak on behalf of people too much. So Louis, maybe I'll hand over to you for the next 10 minutes and the microphone's all yours.
Thank you very much, James. I'm so delighted to join this community in discussing how generative AI is a game changer that we really need to be ready for. And like you mentioned, I work with a global human rights organization called Witness. We work at the intersection of video and technology and human rights. And while appreciating the other huge containers of these conversations and based on what I've had from other sessions, I'd love to telescope into synthetic media, the implications to the protection of human rights, and what can be done. So I would love us to just take a moment to imagine that you have taken out your phone to film evidence of police brutality being meted out to your close family member at a traffic stop. Imagine taking the risk to document that violation only to face the harsh reality of your video being discredited as false due to thoughts that it could be manipulated media. That is the unfortunate reality of many communities who are using video and other visuals to document violations against them. This has in turn contributed to the declining trust in video. Some of you might have heard about the End SARS movement in Nigeria, where civilians organized a series of protests against a condemned police squad. Those protests were also documented on videos that went viral on social media, attracting global support. In one of the live streams that had over 300,000 viewers, the police was seen opening fire against peaceful protesters. But surprisingly, that live stream was discredited as fake news by Nigerian authorities. They even went further to say that it was doctored and produced in green screen. You can already see the scale of targeted disinformation efforts against communities who are already facing harms because of their gender, their tribe, their race, their religion, and sexuality. And add to that now the incursion of synthetic media and deepfakes. And that essentially gives wings to the dissemination of disinformation. The proliferation of generative AI has made it easy to create highly convincing manipulated media. And this has created what we describe as the liar's dividend, which is the benefit received by those spreading false information, whereby it becomes unclear what is true and what is not. In terms of implications to democracy and political rights, civilian populations in conflict situations who suffer grave human rights violations are further threatened with harms emanating from alternative facts and other exaggerations. We saw this during the war in Ukraine. While disinformation campaigns have become a feature of elections, not just in Africa, but globally, they should be of utmost concern because of their serious implications, including fomenting political violence, tribal antagonisms, and unsettling people's faith in democratic institutions. In 2019, some of you might also remember, a deepfake video of the then Gabon's president, Ali Bongo, sparked concerns about his fitness to rule, and that confusion almost led to a coup. In the absence of credible reporting from the ground, such deepfake videos have caused chaos and confusion for citizens. They've also spread confusion and uncertainties around military operations. On the other hand, there are positive uses of AI towards the protection of human rights. There are human rights defenders in Africa who are using synthetic media to create avatars of human rights defenders. This minimizes the risk associated with being a human rights defender while retaining the authentic message of their community. Satirists are also using this technology to create satirical content, which are powerful ways to open up conversations about inequality, injustice, and other power dynamics. So since 2018, Witness has been preparing for the impact of AI on our ability to discern the truth. In consultation with human rights defenders, journalists, technologists across 4 continents, we've identified the most pressing concerns to this end and actionable recommendations on what we must do now. We've based those recommendations on the following 3 guiding principles. 1, center those protecting human rights and democracy at the front lines, the harms they experience and the solutions they prioritize. 2, placing firm responsibility across the AI, tech, and information pipeline. And 3, push for human rights-based technical infrastructure, norms, platform policies, laws, and regulations. Allow me at a very granular level to speak to some of those recommendations. We've heard repeatedly from communities we work with that they need skills, tools, and capacities to detect manipulation. There's an argument, however, that technology to create manipulated content would outpace detection efforts, but it's still needed regardless. And in detection, we have to speak about detection equity, where the question is not only of access to those tools, but also the skill set to use them. For example, why is it not easy to do a reverse image search within the social media platforms that we use? We also need ways to show where the media came from or how it was made, whether by humans, AI, or a combination of both, without compromising on privacy or excluding people who don't have access to tools. This calls for the need to build authenticity and provenance infrastructures whose design and implementation should be shaped by human rights considerations. One example of that has already been mentioned, and there was a presentation on yesterday in this forum, is the C2PA coalition, which provides technical standards to trace the origin of different types of media. And Witness is part of that coalition alongside other players such as Adobe. Technology companies, legislators, and policymakers should identify risks, create threat models, and prioritize solutions, centering global perspectives that are grounded in the lived and practical and expert experience of vulnerable and excluded people facing similar harms. Human rights and accessibility concern should also shape the design and implementation of watermarks, labels, and other solutions that verify provenance, like the C2PA. And finally, strengthen the capacity of communities to fortify the truth in an increasingly challenging information environment. As an organization, our new strategic vision seeks to proactively empower communities around emerging tactics such as verification, curation, analysis, and presentation. So I'd love to stop there, but speak to some of those recommendations in the discussion that ensues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Louis. I think everything that you've highlighted in your speech has really complemented the numerous presentations that we've had over the course of this conference. Yeah, thank you so much for raising that liar's dividend issue, which has been raised on other days, but is so pernicious. And I think it's so important that we get appreciation of just how damaging that can be, especially for our stakeholders when they engage in public discourse and public debate. You know, this idea of losing that tether of what's real, what's objective reality is really, really damaging, including at that human rights level. If people are denying that human rights abuses are happening and accusing it of being fake news and artificially generated. And I think also it's really important that emphasis on access to the skills as well as access to the tools. It's important to be holistic in how we approach that. And I really liked not to reduce your presentation to a soundbite, but I really liked the term "fortify the truth." I think that sums it up really, really nicely. So thank you so much, Louis, and also looking forward to hopefully having a bit more of a discussion during the roundtable component of this session. So next I'll invite Professor Ifeanyi Ejiofor to deliver some of her remarks. Professor, the microphone's all yours.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you very much for inviting me to join this very important conversation. And I want to thank Louis as well for providing a very impressive introduction to the conversation about human rights and generative AI. I would like to particularly follow on from Louis' points and highlight the importance of embedding human rights in the design and deployment of AI. And particularly, he had talked about some of the resultant effects as to how AI is being deployed. And I think a very important point of starting the conversation is actually how do we embed human rights standards and principles, starting from the foundation, which is at the time technologies, the AI technologies are being designed and when they are being deployed. And I think it's important to cast our minds back as to the dimensions that these abuses inherent in generative AI may take. On the one hand, like Louis pointed out, you find that it may be direct. But I think what is more concerning is when the human rights abuses that are permeated by AI technologies are actually indirect. So we begin to see that, you know, you're having AI reproducing, reinforcing, and compounding human rights abuses, even when they are deployed for good reasons. Of course, we know that AI is often developed with intentions to solve real-world problems, but this does not mean that, you know, this human rights violation or enhancing human rights violation will not be inherent in AI. Unfortunately, the other issue we tend to see is that where we are now in society, we lack internationally agreed laws, policies, and strategies. So we find regions scrambling to develop norms, standards to protect humans, as to how AI is being deployed, but then there is no internationally agreed standard. There are also hardly government coordinated oversight and control mechanisms that are specifically related to human rights. For example, if you look at the EU AI Act, there is so much focus on ethics rather than human rights standard. You also find companies trying to direct these limitations themselves. And so it means that human rights standards are not enforced on a normative basis or on an obligatory basis. And traditionally, you also see that business and human rights standards tend to be voluntary, based on voluntary mechanisms rather than normative and binding obligations. And so that is why I tend to ask three key questions. The first one is whether the existing or extant business and human rights norms and frameworks are adequate to address the business complexities in relation to AI and human rights, whether our approach to govern AI is adequate enough, and whether it is important to mandate tech companies to imply key human rights standards in the design stages rather than, looking for an after effect or addressing issues after we've seen results that tend to enhance or advance human rights violations, and whether artificial intelligence would be implicated in human rights discourses, especially when we think about intent, obligations, and responsibilities. And that is why we're beginning to see conversations about a human rights-based approach to designing, human rights by design. Is it possible that we can actually design on the basis of human rights? And I just want to cast our minds back particularly to agency, the role that humans play in these conversations, in these issues about how AI is also encouraging abuses of human rights. We must remember that technology is not neutral, but inherently political. And that was why I was very interested in the first session, when the speakers were talking about how politics has tended to compound the issues we're discussing. So technology in itself may be neutral, but the actors behind technology are not neutral. It means that AI in itself would also be fallible because of existing oppression, systemic marginalization, the creation of new equalities, as well as amplifying the old inequalities. The other issue we hardly talk about when we think of human rights is the dichotomy in the northern and southern epistemologies in the design of AI, as we are seeing. So you find that there is a dominance of northern epistemologies in the role of technology in politics and public life, especially when you think of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and the impact that AI and human rights discourses may be having in those regions. Why do I say this? You see that the capabilities for some of these regions are largely driven by foreign tech companies, as well as resource constraints. It also means that because of the powerful nature of some of these tech companies, the design and deployment of AI will have very minimal discussions of monitoring and assessing accountability. So you would also find that there is little accountability for human rights interests. So on the one hand, we have to look at this from geopolitical issues, as well as the realities of resource constraint, as well as the realities of who has the primary interest in the development and deployment of AI, and what those implications will mean for regions in terms of human rights, whether it's for privacy, whether it's for freedom of expression, and whether it's for racial inequality and racial discrimination. I undertook a research as part of my role at the Carr Center at Harvard, and I looked at design thinking. Now, design thinking is a model that has been proposed by the Stanford University, the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design at Stanford University. And they actually proposed 5 steps to design thinking: empathy, define, ideate, prototype, and test. Now, that model, in terms of empathy, it's about learning the audience for whom you are designing. So rather than just go into designing technologies, you need to learn about the audience. And then you go on to redefining and focusing the questions that will lead to the product based on the insights you have from the empathy stage. And then you begin to brainstorm and come up with creative solutions. You build your representation of your ideas, but particularly at the end, you need to test the product, and it mandates you returning to the original user group and testing your ideas for feedback before you deploy technology. What this means is that tech companies must put themselves in the shoes of users. And this can be done by tech companies simply empathizing with the expected users. What would privacy mean for the users? What would freedom of speech mean for the users? If this technology is deployed, will it discriminate racially against a certain group of people? Therefore, it means that it's a human-centric approach. Humans must be centered. It must be a people-centered approach if these 5 steps are deployed effectively. And for time, I can't go into details about it. But then again, you find that tech companies tend to use the word human-centered. And then you find that there is no clear definition of what human-centric means. And that is why a human rights approach is better than using the term human-centric. Should we rather use human rights, because there are clear standards in terms of human rights. Human rights speak for non-discrimination. Human rights speak for transparency. Human rights speak for accountability. Can this rather be the basis rather than just saying a human-centric approach? And then it also means that in terms of design thinking, tech companies must embed key principles in the process. It also means that those who hold rights have the obligation to fulfill those rights, and those who have duties have the obligation to fulfill those duties. And it means that we have to then assess obligations, assess duty holders, and mandate them to fulfill their obligations. And that is why we have to answer clearly, do we want voluntary obligations, or should we rather focus on mandatory obligations? And I want to say that the nature of AI calls for an advanced nature of obligation on all subjects involved. It's no longer business as usual. What we've had as an approach to business and human rights will no longer continue to suffice. And so we must embed human rights-based approaches around decision-making and emphasize accountability, even in the organizational practice, even in the design practice, including through legislations and policies. And I know that, for example, there are existing standards, for example, the OECD's guideline on due diligence. There is also the project of a BTEC project of the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Interestingly, we all know that the Council of Europe's draft convention on AI, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law has been out. Although I have some issues with the convention, but it's a good step, considering, for example, there is a mention of gender non-discrimination, but then there is no mention of racial discrimination as well as part of that convention. But we'll get to see where that will lead us as we're advancing in terms of this conversation. I just want to end by saying that as part of human rights obligations, thankfully, this program or this event is focused on the needs for laws, policies. I want to say that states must also ensure that human rights are protected in the realm of non-state actors. And you find that because of digital technologies and AI, the dichotomy between state and non-state actors is becoming a bit blurry. And so you would find that it may be challenging determining mandatory obligations for tech companies. However, we must find ways to approach that conversation. I also want to say that it's a degradation of the entire human rights value if we only focus on privacy concerns and we don't look at all other human rights that are very important. There are so many human rights that are implicated. And another challenge has been also this differentiation between civil and political rights and social and economic rights, which means that when you come to social and economic rights, it may also be a challenge for enforcing obligations on tech companies. But I think that as we go on, it's important that as we have the conversations and as we look forward to what will happen in December with the AI and human rights conversation, that these approaches are tabled in a right manner that underscores all human rights as inherent and as equal on all bases, determining obligation and mandatory promotion and protection of human rights. Thank you, James.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that presentation and the emphasis on embedding human rights in the development and deployment of AI at that very initial stage. I think that's really, really important. This idea of the indirect human rights abuses, I think, spoke a little bit to some of the conversations having the previous session as well, where it's not, you don't always need those malicious intentions, but even AI designed for good can carry threats as well. Yeah, definitely heard running themes over the previous days about lacking that international cross-border legal frameworks. So I think that's something that does need to be addressed. and also that AI will never be completely infallible. There'll always be issues within it, biases within it, and how you can really mitigate against those again at that design development stage. And I also really like this idea of empathy, learning your audience, and having yeah, completely agree. We hear a lot about people centered, but yeah, I agree. I've never heard that be clearly defined, whereas the human rights approach where we have quite a few examples of what those standards would look like, and mainstreaming those and being a bit more clear in the language used. And I think those two presentations really complemented each other really well, and also speak to some of the questions that I have as part of what will hopefully be a good 15 to 20 minutes of conversation. And I just want to go back to some of the transparency and trust elements. We've spoken a little bit about things like C2PA, content provenance, authenticity. And it's a question I've put to panelists over the previous few days as well, and just trying to canvass opinion on this, whether we are talking about transparency, whether we are talking about trying to build trust, whether it's really realistic to ever build trust, and also to speak to what Louis was saying about providing the necessary skills. Is this more about providing literacy, digital literacy, provenance literacy, authenticity literacy? Because we could be completely transparent on content provenance and give a lot of information about this is where the image was taken, and here's all the various AI generated changes that were made to it. And for the layperson, they might not be able to translate that in a way that makes sense to them. So you can have absolute transparency, but very difficult to build trust. Or you just say, look, trust us, here's a watermark, here's a standard, you don't have to look at transparency. So really, it's I think it's a multifaceted question, but really, how do we build the literacy? Should we be focusing more on the literacy? And maybe I'll come back to Louis to allow you to maybe elaborate a little bit on that need for the skills in this space.
Yeah, thank you, James. This conversation around transparency in AI, it's a very important ingredient, in building a human rights approach, very important connective tissue. But let's put things into context. And I'd want to ask, how many social media users do we have worldwide? And in Africa, I think it's more than 60% of the world's population, around 4.8 billion on social media, and in Africa around slightly under 400 million. For sure, we do not really expect all these users to have a media literacy skill set, even at basic level. And now that we're talking about synthetic media outputs, which can be more sophisticated, it would even be harder for them to be able to identify them. A few years ago, when deepfakes and deepfakes video was super new and arrived at the scene, people would easily identify them because of what you call the eye not blinking, right? But these days, the eyes are blinking, and it's very hard to identify that this is a fake or not. So I'm not discounting media literacy, but having media literacy capability is really on the part of the consumer. It's desirable, is a great antidote. However, it's rather unsustainable. And that is why this burden, around transparency should be shared on all those involved in the information ecosystem and in the development of these technologies. I can't stress enough the need for pipeline responsibility, from those creating infrastructure for media, to those creating tools, to those creating content, to those platforms distributing the content, and also the consumer, And there's this mantra in tech that when you invent new technology, you also uncover a new class of responsibilities, and that should be distributed, across across that pipeline from the upstream and downstream stakeholders?
Thanks so much, Louis. I'll pose the same question to you, Professor Ifeanyi Ajufo.
Thank you, James, and of course, as well to Louis. I just want to add to Louis' points, but of course, I will speak from a human rights perspective. The first thing I want to say is, can we have transparency without literacy? It's a very rhetoric but very deep question that sort of answers itself. I remember one of Manuel Castell's points when he wrote about Internet Galaxy. He said the internet, talking about the internet, he says is a technology of freedom. It can free the powerful to oppress the uninformed, and it may lead to exclusion of the devalued by the conquerors of value. So which means that on one hand, if you think about technology, it can be a tool to oppress those who are uninformed. And so that is why I would say that literacy is embedded in transparency. We can't have one without the other. You can't claim transparency where there is no literacy in that sense of it. Then it means that the benefit is not for the people. And the other question is, who exactly are these technologies created for? Who is going to benefit from them? And then you begin to answer whether transparency can exist, whether trust can exist without knowledge, without information, and without literacy. And so oftentimes we find that humans are carried away by the fantasies, by the beauty of these technologies, what AI can do, and we necessarily do not think of the impact. And so laws and norms must also encourage a culture of transparency, of literacy, and of education. And when we think about whether we want obligations embedded as norms, as principles, we must also look at an institutional framework. I will draw an example from the UN process elaborating the Global Cybercrime Convention. Now, one of the things we discuss is having a cybersecurity culture, for example. And so when you think of AI, you must think of a culture. The essence is that laws cannot change culture. Simply making laws and policies will not change how people think about things or how tech companies would behave or what their expectations are. And so there should be a mandate that there should be a culture of human rights by design. And what that will mean is that you begin to mandate tech companies to also educate and also think about educating about the security challenges, the challenges with limiting human rights in terms of deployment and design of AI. We need clear instructions. When I use AI, when I use these technologies, I need to be clear as to how my rights may be infringed on. I need to be clear as to what the limitations to my rights to privacy may be. There should be clear mandates on platforms. There should be clear mandates on tools. There should be clear instructions. Now, literacy must not necessarily be formal. They can be informal in terms of how we approach that. Now, is it possible that there should also be literacy as to how technologies are deployed? On the platforms, when you use these platforms, when you use these tools, are you clear as to how you're directed to use them? The other issue we need to think about as well is digital equalities in terms of when we want to think about transparency and literacy. And I know that sometimes I tend to sort of overflog the issues as to where technologies are coming from. And this is because of the politics of ownership and shareholder structures, and why it is important for governments in certain regions to think about the ability of citizens to use certain technologies. How do we look at them in terms of oversight in designing and deployment? So when we think about the fact that most AI are designed and deployed, most generative AI technologies are built in the global north countries, it means that certain people from certain regions, and I know Louis talked about this, for example, people in Africa, it means that there are vast ethnic populations that are also not understanding what these conversations are about. And it's important that we look at them as well from the basis of human rights. The other thing I want to point out to is when we think about human rights concepts, it mandates participation and inclusion. Inclusion and participation are key human rights principles and standards. And that is why I also said you cannot divorce literacy from transparency. If you think about inclusion and participation, then literacy would have to be key. If some people are not knowledgeable or understanding or have the ability to underscore the value inherent in these technologies that are deployed, then we cannot argue that they are fully participating and that they are fully included. And so I will still end again by saying that they are both one of the same. Transparency should be key, but at the same time, transparency also results and means that there is literacy and that there is clarity as to how we deploy AI.
Thank you so much, Nyenya. I also want to just maybe I'll stay with yourself for this next question. You spoke about understanding your audience, learn your audience, to try and, in part at least, address any bias that could creep into the AI. And I wonder if you could maybe expand upon that a little bit and how we can ensure that generative AI is inclusive and respectful of diversity in thought and avoid amplifying biases, and maybe whether as part of that we need more diversity of thought and diversity of voices in developing it in the teams that actually develop it. I know that there's several facial recognition technologies that don't recognize people of certain backgrounds vis-a-vis others. So if you could just expand upon that a little bit.
I was muted. I think it goes back to the issue of agency. You know, I said earlier that, you know, technologies may seem neutral, but the actors behind technologies in themselves are not neutral. And so I would not make this particular conversation about technologies, but about the actors behind the deployment. Of course, I know with generative AI, when data has been fed into systems over time, you may then argue that humans are not necessarily involved as to how the deployment continues. But then it doesn't take away from the fact that there are actors behind the deployment and the design of technologies. And that is where I think a key debate we are not having, I will say that again, is digital equalities. Technologies, whether AI, are laden with cultural, historical, and political interests. And I think there is, on the one hand, the UN system, which is the extant international human rights framework, which we must mandate, but there are also political discussions that must be had as to the issues of primacy, technology dependence, and who is on the seat of the decision-making table. And when we are having conversations at the UN level, I think that is where the importance of inclusion and diversity begins. When you have discussions and certain parts of the world and certain parts of the geographical distribution are not part of the discussions, it means that all interest will not be reflected, whether in terms of diversity, in terms of bias, in terms of inclusion, and in terms of respect for human rights. So when we have conversations that all geographical regions sit on the table, it means that we begin to look at these conversations from historical perspective. Now, how you would interpret data supremacy or data primacy in the West may not necessarily be the same way it is done in Africa. And so you have to underscore what this means, as well as policies as well. Where do we have all the policies? Are we having conversations in the fact that there should be mandates for policies across, so that while certain parts of the world are leapfrogging into stages of policy conversations, for example, the EU, the Council of Europe, with the Convention on AI and Human Rights, there are parts of jurisdictions where people are not even discussing having AI as a national policy consideration. The other issue is accountability. How are we going to move into monitoring and ensuring accountability? And I know that the UN is taking steps to see that that is going to happen. The other issue is, before we can begin to talk of respect for diversity, ethics alone will not be a result. Ethics alone, when we couch the terms of the conversation as ethics rather than human rights standards, it would not build or create the sort of result we are thinking about. And finally, I would also say that people need to be empowered to understand, and this follows from the first point of literacy. People need to be empowered. A people-centered approach means that people are empowered, not just in terms of providing them access to technologies, but at the same time, empowering them to understand use for their benefits in a way that underscores the promotion of their human rights.
Thank you so much, Nyenya. I'm conscious of time, so maybe I'll pass over to Louis for his thoughts on that same question. I did have one more question about giving a call to action for our parliamentarians, but I think through these conversations we've kind of addressed that already. So Louis, I'll give you the final words for this session, and then close.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something brief in sequel to Nyanya's talking point on the importance of centering global realities and human rights, so that these technologies are not perpetuating existing bias. Take a look at voice AI assistants, and I'm talking about at product design and implementation level. So take a look at your Alexas, your Cortana, your Siris. They are all female voices, right? What does that suggest about women? That they're relegated to those domestic assistant jobs, So if at that stage, these builders can be able to think about, these things. And there's an argument that is made, that female voices pronounce vowels better, than the men, and yada, yada, yada. But you see, in global reality, I think it's a nuanced conversation that, these builders need to think about. I wanted to quickly move on to what exactly downstream stakeholders, parliamentarians, and policymakers would do if time allows. And just to say that there are various legislative proposals around securing the integrity of audiovisual material. And in the US, for example, there's this piece of legislation that was put forth at the Senate in July, and it's kind of most comprehensive, up to date, by Senator, I think, John Kennedy. And even most recently, like Prof mentioned, the EU AI Act. So these regulatory proposals should avoid introducing blanket requirements, for compulsory disclosure of audiovisual content, unless they're carefully thought through, so that they don't infringe, on other human rights and stifle freedom of expression and technology whistleblowing, or worse, enable surveillance. And these proposals ought to take into account the realities of communities in the global South, like Prof mentioned. Since the technology has been deployed in those, it caters for people in those jurisdictions, the US and Europe. Equally, when making those laws, it makes sense to consult these other jurisdictions in the global South, so that they're on the table, as these consultations are really ongoing. Then to sum it up, I really love what Prof said around education. So on a personal level, my invitation is really, if you're a tech builder, if you're a tech deployer, go to school, learn about philosophy, learn about history, learn about human rights, so that you are better, able to understand the impact of the technology you're really deploying. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Louis, and thank you also again to Professor Nyanya. I think that was a fantastic session, followed on really nicely from the session that preceded it, and also the days that have preceded today. So again, enormous thanks to you both. And as I said to the previous session speakers, please do feel free to stay online with us if you're interested in the following sessions. I know that we have a session lined up on deepfakes and whether it constitutes a new form of online gender-based violence. So if that's of interest, please do stay online, and just kindly ask you to just mute and turn your cameras off if you are planning to stay with us. I think the past 2 days we have invited attendees to just take 5 minutes midway through the day's schedules to allow you to stand up, move around, rest your eyes, rest your minds a little bit. So we'll just have a 5-minute pause now before we start that next session. Please do stay online. Please don't log off. please do stick with us. It's a really interesting session coming up next, and also those of you who have looked in depth at the program will have realised we've got a really exciting opportunity as part of the closing remarks to hear from a speaker. It's not our usual approach of platitudes and votes of thanks as part of the closing remarks. We do have a substantive element involved there. So please do stay logged on, but please do feel free to leave your desk for the next 5 minutes. So yeah, I'll start the clock running from now before I hand over to my colleague who will be leading on the next session. So thank you again, everybody.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to all of you who are participating in this final session. If the panelists would kindly come on camera, ready for, thank you very much. Hi there.
Hello, Charlotte, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Great, let's get going. Okay, so my name's Charlotte Corby. I'm a research intern at CPA. I'll be facilitating this session, and it is all about deepfakes and whether this constitutes a new gender-based violence, new sort of online GBV. Also, I'm particularly grateful for those joining us today from the CWP workshop in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. They are just in another room across from me, so hopefully everything's going okay technically there, and we'll get started. For this session, we will have contributions from 3 expert panelists in their fields, followed by a very brief Q&A. So do feel free to add any questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, as you've been doing. I'm sure everyone's been enjoying the sessions that they've attended so far. I'm really glad to see lots of people here for us for this final session from these great speakers. So without further ado, we have speaking first, Susie Dunn, who is an assistant professor at Dalhousie University's Scollage School of Law. Her research centres on intersections of equality, technology and the law, with a specific focus on artificial intelligence and technology-facilitated gender-based violence. Currently, she is a senior fellow with the Centre for International Governance Innovations supporting a Safer Internet project, and is a member of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund Technology Facilitated Violence Committee. After that, we will have a contribution from Dr. Kiran Hassan. Dr. Kiran Hassan is a coordinator of freedom of expression and digital rights at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. She holds an MSc in social anthropology from the LSE and a PhD in political communication from the School of Advanced Studies. She has taught international relations at SOAS and global communications at NYU. She has been the South Asian expert at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and she has been a contributor to various media and anthropological research projects with a focus on social media audience consumption patterns with the BBC World Service and the Open University. She observes and reports on emerging media trends in 56 Commonwealth countries. Her current research focuses on online violence against women, climate communication, policy and digital rights. She continues to publish and present her interdisciplinary work at international academic and policy platforms. Our third and final contribution is a pre-recorded contribution. Unfortunately, the colleague couldn't be with us today, but it will be from Baraidzo Magodo Matimba, who is a Grants and Growth Coordinator at policy.org, which is based in Uganda. She has a background in Pan-African feminist law and will be discussing the work of policy and their role as a feminist collective of technologists, data scientists, creatives, and academics working at the intersection of data, design, and technology. She will have a discussion of her research and the research of policy more widely, specifically speaking to the future of work and digital safety for women in the workplace, most specifically for parliamentarians. So, if I can hand over to Susie Dunn for our first contribution. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. I'm really happy to be here, and thanks for all of you who stayed on. I know doing these full-day Zoom sessions can be quite a lot. I'm just going to share my slides. Great. So today I'll be talking to you about deepfakes and digital identity manipulation. This is an area of law and social policy that I've been studying for about 7 years now, and I'm quite interested in the various ways that it shows up. I will be focusing specifically on the gender-based aspect of deepfakes. So although there's a wide variety of ways that deepfakes are used, some are used in really playful, satirical ways. Some ways they're used for really creative art. There's a lot of positive uses for deepfakes, but I'll be focusing on some of the harmful uses of deepfakes, and specifically non-consensually sexually made deepfakes, and the impact that it has on women, parliamentarians, and future legislation as we think about how to regulate this new type of technology. So when we hear the word deepfakes, often the term deepfakes is overused and kind of encompasses a lot more than what the term actually means. When we talk about deepfakes, we're often talking about what's known as synthetic media. And I saw that someone already shared some information about Witness. It's a nonprofit organization that does research on deepfakes and AI. They're a really amazing organization, and they've done some typological analysis on the different types of synthetic media, which includes deepfakes. But synthetic media is essentially any form of video, audio, or visual material where some form of technology, typically artificial intelligence, has been used to either create or manipulate those images. And so deepfakes are a particular type of synthetic media that require some sort of a base video that then takes a face set of another person and superimposes their face onto an existing video, so it looks as though they're saying or doing something they've never said or done. But we also see versions of synthetic media that can be done live. So facial reenactments is very similar to deepfakes, where one face is superimposed onto another person's face, but the face will be moving and acting during a live video rather than superimposing it on a pre-existing video. I'm also particularly interested in voice cloning, and I think especially when it comes to the impact on politicians and parliamentarians, voice cloning is actually proven to be a lot more convincing than visual deepfakes. Often there's opportunities to kind of debunk visual deepfakes, but with voice cloning, we've seen many examples of people getting audio of a particular person, making an AI clone of their voice, and then engaging with them in a telephone conversation and either convincing them to do something. There was an example of someone who transferred large amounts of money to someone that they shouldn't have, or just to be able to get information out of them. And when you think about the realm of politics, if you get a call from someone who might sound like, say, a parliamentarian or a prime minister or someone who's in a senior position, and they're able to convince you that they're a real person, you can see some of the real threats that come up with voice cloning. And more recently, there's generative AI. So these are the large language models, the photo processing and photo generating AI tools that we've seen become quite popular in the last year. DALL-E, Midjourney, ChatGPT, these types of things are also a new form of synthetic media. And so when we're thinking about deepfakes in particular, there's quite a few different types of harms that can occur. There's image-based sexual abuse, which is of course when someone creates a non-consensual sexual or pornographic video of another person. There's identity attacks. We've seen the use of deepfakes used to present someone saying something or doing something in a non-sexual context that impacts their reputation. And political interference. There's a lot of fear around the use of deepfakes for political interference, but in fact, we actually haven't seen that many political deepfakes either be created or be successful in actually impacting politics. There's been some examples such as the Ukrainian President Zelensky had a deepfake made of him early on in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, saying that his soldiers should disarm and retreat, but that was debunked very quickly. But we haven't seen a large amount of political deepfakes coming out yet. though as the technology becomes more accessible, we may see more of that. But primarily what we're seeing is that it's these sexual deepfakes. It is the main use of both harmful and non-harmful deepfakes. And as I mentioned before, deepfakes can also be used for fraudulent purposes to try and get money transfers or information transfers fraudulently. And so the way that I conceptualize non-consensual sexual deepfakes is under this umbrella term of what's known as image-based sexual abuse. And this is a term that was coined by Claire McGlynn out of the UK. And it's an umbrella term that covers the variety of sexual abuse materials that we're seeing showing up in digital spaces. So this could be anything from child sexual abuse material, voyeurism, which are secret photos that are taken of people engaged in sexual activity, the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, sexual extortion, which we've seen a significant increase in, particularly following the pandemic. And even here in Canada, we had one of our MPs be extorted when he shared sexual images of himself with someone he met online, who then later he was extorted. And when you think about the security risks to that, if a parliamentarian was caught in a situation of sexual extortion, whether it be deepfakes or real images, you can see that there's real risks politically for those issues. But this is encompassed under this larger concept of image-based sexual abuse, which is in fact a form of gender-based violence. What we know with the majority of these types of harms is that women are overrepresented, and even in cases where women aren't necessarily overrepresented in the number of incidents, we see the impact on women is much higher because of sexual stereotypes about women needing to be sexually chaste and not have sexual images of themselves. When sexual images of themselves are released, it has a much higher impact on their reputation. And so statistically, what we know is that deepfakes are primarily made of non-consensual sexual deepfakes of women. An early study that was done about 5 years ago by Sensity AI called The State of Deepfakes found that primarily these deepfakes were made of celebrities out of the United States, the United Kingdom, and South Korea. At the time, they were able to find around 15,000 or so deepfakes online. Now there are hundreds of thousands of deepfakes online, and those are the only ones that are publicly accessible. And we know that there's more deepfakes that are being created for private use that aren't actually public-facing on the internet. The Sensity study showed that 96% of the deepfakes they were able to locate online were in fact non-consensual sexual deepfakes of women. And so often as regulators and people who are really concerned about the impacts of AI, sometimes we can get distracted by the hype of AI. So when we think of AI in a general term, thinking about, AI taking over the world, or deepfakes, deepfakes changing elections and deepfakes impacting national security. There's often a lot of hype that we hear about how AI is harming people or could potentially harm people. But when we look at the reality of the ways that AI actually is harming people right now in its current form, often what we see, it's through forms of discrimination, gender discrimination, racial bias, these types of things. And the same thing is true with deepfakes, where we see that the primary issue, the actual true harm in the amount of harmful deepfakes that are being created are actually these non-consensual sexual deepfakes. And so when we're thinking about regulation to protect people from this harmful material, a large focus should be on this aspect, which is really how deepfakes are causing harm to people. And I found it interesting at the beginning, this question, like, is it a form of gender-based violence? And I would say unquestionably, this is on the continuum of gender-based violence. It's another form of sexual abuse, targeting primarily women. You don't see many sexual deepfakes of men in general online. They're almost all of women. And while the Sensity report that was released a few years ago suggested that celebrities are the primary victims, that continues to be true. If you look at sexual deepfake websites, you will see it's primarily celebrities, but you can also find deepfakes of politicians. In one of the last searches I did, it was very easy to find deepfakes of Michelle Obama, of Hillary Clinton, of Ivanka Trump. So you're seeing deepfakes being made, and often people realize those deepfakes are fake, but we have seen cases where they have been used to try and suggest that they're real during elections. We've seen this in places like Ireland. There's been several countries where women politicians, particularly in moments of elections, have had deepfakes made of them to suggest that they are not fit for office and that they're actually engaged in illicit sexual activity that could harm their reputation and their capacity to be voted in. We've also seen a trend of deepfakes being made of journalists to discredit journalists. We saw this with Rana Ayyub in India, where she was a journalist reporting, critiquing the Indian government and speaking out about sexual violence. And she had a deepfake made of her to discredit her in that country. Activists, we've seen Anita Sarkeesian and various activists have had sexual deepfakes made of them to either humiliate them, shame them, or try and discredit them. And another trend that we're seeing that really impacts our ability to be safe in the workplace, our colleagues are making deepfakes of each other. And so one of the clearest examples was a Twitch gamer user who was online, and he was caught watching and paying for videos that were made non-consensually of other female Twitch gamers that were publicly available on a paid website. And so we're starting to see an increase of more everyday people showing up in deepfakes rather than just celebrities. But essentially, a lot of the principles behind deepfakes and deepfake creation is essentially that if you're a woman who exists in public spaces, that people are entitled to create these sexual deepfakes of you. And I think that's something that we really need to challenge, and also challenge this idea that just because it's not our actual bodies that are represented in these deepfakes, that they don't cause harms. Another trend that we're seeing is that you can actually pay people to make deepfakes for you, whether they're sexual deepfakes or non-sexual deepfakes. There's all sorts of platforms and people available online who are willing to create programs that can perfect a deepfake of a particular person's face, and then that can be matched on to other deepfakes of them either doing or saying things they haven't done, or onto particular pornographic videos or sexual videos. So even if you don't have the capacity or technical skill set to be able to make a deepfake yourself, you can now go onto the internet and pay someone to make a deepfake. And so you can think of the possibility of the ways that bad actors could take advantage of this situation. Oh, and this is a study that I was just reading the other day that I thought was worthwhile to bring up. It was a study out of the United States by Professor Matthew Kugler and Carly Pace. And it was looking at the public perception of whether we should regulate deepfakes or not. And in his study, he found high acceptance of wanting to regulate deepfakes, particularly for sexual deepfakes. And one of the statistics that I found interesting in his quantitative research was that when it came to moral blameworthiness, people actually rated the creation and distribution of sexual deepfakes as having higher moral blameworthiness than distributing actual nude images of another person. And so I think there's something interesting in there in the way that people who are co-opting other people's bodies, co-opting their sexuality, and then putting them online could potentially be considered even more morally blameworthy than sharing actual nude images of a person, which in many ways causes a different form of sexual harm to your integrity and bodily autonomy. But I just thought it was a very interesting study coming out of the United States. When it comes to the harms created by sexual deepfakes, there's significant stress and mental health. While there hasn't been a lot of research on deepfakes in particular, what we've seen about image-based sexual abuse is that there's similar mental health and stress impacts that are comparable to actual sexual violence, physical sexual violence. There's real bodily and sexual autonomy and integrity issues that come up if we are permissive about the creation and distribution of sexual deepfakes. It reinforces this real sexist entitlement to women's bodies, as though just because their photos exist online, that then they're available fodder for men's sexual access to them. It also silences women who have deepfakes made about them or are fearful about sexual deepfakes being made about them, often retreat from online spaces, They avoid engaging in publicly facing roles online, whether that be through politics, media, or other forms of engagement. I think the gamer example is a classic example, just being a female gamer online. There's a risk of having these sexual deepfakes made of you, which discourages you from participating in those communities and making videos of yourself. And it can also be extremely costly to remove deepfakes online. In the same way with nude images, once they've been released online, people often have to hire reputation managers to get this content removed, which can be thousands of dollars a month, and is something that sometimes has to be lifelong, because these images and videos will pop up over and over. And so in the last minute before I wrap up, I'll make a few points on law reform for those of you who might be thinking about potential law reform when it comes to deepfake. And I think there's some really interesting things to think about. One is regulating the actual technology. So for example, we know things like Google has the capacity to de-index harmful websites. And so you could regulate platforms, content moderation, and require the de-indexing or deletion of non-consensual deepfakes. You could have regulations around sites and technology that's dedicated to the creation and distribution of non-consensual deepfakes. And then you need to consider, are you going to regulate just the creation of deepfakes, the possession or distribution? To date, it mostly seems that the distribution is being regulated. Though when we look at things like child pornography and voyeurism, we do actually regulate the creation and possession of different forms of image-based abuse. So it's something to consider, and also the threats of distribution. Effective tools that we've seen for countering and supporting people who faced image-based abuse are agencies and help centers. We see this in many Commonwealth countries, NetSafe in New Zealand, the eSafety Commissioner in Australia. Pakistan has a really extraordinarily helpline for victims of image-based abuse. And this is something that governments can do, even if they're not going to regulate deepfakes. They can provide supports to people who may have been victimized through agencies and help centers. Internationally, we've seen various legal solutions, such as including altered images and deepfakes in criminal and civil non-consensual distribution of intimate image laws. People have used copyright as a way to get deepfakes taken down. We've seen deepfake regulation around elections, not allowing deepfakes close to election times. Privacy laws such as false light or personality rights can be used, and also social media regulation, which is sometimes the most effective tool in getting content removed as soon as possible. But I'll wrap up there, and we'll leave questions and answers until all the other participants have gone through. But I look forward to hearing your questions. And if you'd like to follow up with me in any way, this is my website, my email, and my Twitter handle. And happy to chat further after the session. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Susie. That was fantastic. Really, really insightful. I particularly found kind of the discussion of moral blameworthiness kind of a novel angle that I'd not really thought about too much before. It kind of speaks to a bit of a measurement of harm, which is certainly, in terms of regulation, something that will need to be highly considered. So yeah, really interesting. Thank you. Can I now pass over to Dr. Kiran Hassan? Are you ready?
Hello. Yes, Charlotte. First of all, thank you so much to the Commonwealth Parliamentarian Association and your team for actually providing me with this opportunity to talk about a very important issue. So I'm going to be talking about women politicians facing online harassment and violence on social media. This has been part of my research. And I'll just go directly into what some of the kind of very disturbing trends that I've observed while looking at this particular phenomenon. So historically, women have been targets of male misogyny. We've had, Cleopatra, women politicians. We've had Cleopatra being just targeted as a wild seductress, killing brothers and causing wars. Then we had Evita Peron being targeted and being media scrutiny and called a harlot. And then we also had, late Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, who was just had to endure sexual campaigns before, sexually maligning campaigns before the elections. So this is not a new phenomenon, but this problem of female parliamentarians facing violence and sexualized abuse has gone out of control with the advent of social media, AI technology, and deepfakes. And I'm going to be talking about several kind of very disturbing, 4 disturbing trends that have emerged in a very short period of time. But before that, I would also like to say that, safeguarding democracy is one of the core areas of the Commonwealth principles. And, unchecked and unaccounted for online violence and harassment of female politicians on major tech platforms, if it's not really, it really is putting democratic cultures into danger, where Commonwealth member countries can collaborate and address this issue at a unified, multi-governmental platform. So there's a real opportunity whereby a 56 common member country platform can actually address this issue and bring it in a much more of a potent way to in one of its in one of its chogams or big platforms. Coming to the kind of 4 very disturbing trends. One is that there is a dwindling female participation in politics and careers in politics. A recent report by Interparliamentary Union and UN Women has actually said that, has reported that, younger females are not interested or they're just shying away from following careers in politics. And one of the core reasons is that, they're quite afraid of the kind of online harassment and violence that that female politicians have had to, are enduring at the moment. And this is also because we have a kind of very younger voter base all across the world. And so a recent global survey suggested that is documenting that, young girls are again not interested in following political careers, and it's going to take around 60 to 80 years to achieve gender parity in parliamentarians if we are going to go with the rate of how females are joining careers in politics. So this is a real problem, basically. And the same survey, there was also the same survey also had they had women look at the age of from 18 to 74, and they found that the younger women, which were from Generation Z and millennials, were 45%. They had to endure online sexual violence or harassment, considering if it was compared with women who were like from Generation X and baby boomers. Also, the young females in this very year, there were 2 events which demonstrate why the younger female population might not be wanting to join political careers as much as, or they're not very attractive to them, is because we had in January 2023, ex-Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern actually stepping down from her office, and she's a very well-loved female politician. And one of her one of the reasons that she said was that she had to endure excessive trolling and hate speech online because of the policy decisions that she took. And in her last speech, in her leaving speech, she said, "I'm human. Politicians are human. We give all that we can for as long as we can." And so that's not a very good. I mean, that these are the kind of serious kind of problems that a female in political offices, and the higher they are, they have to face that. Then there was also some female parliamentarians in Zimbabwe elections in this very year, and they had to, and there are several reports which suggest that these the younger females were not interested in actually joining politics because of the same reason that there is a whole lot of online harassment and violence that they have to endure if they are going for this particular profession. So that's a big problem if we are going to be seeing that, if there's not going to be a gender equality in the political voice and political spectrum, where are we? Which goes to the second very big, deep trend, problematic trend, and which is with the birth of these AI, deepfakes, synthetic media, and technologies. Female politicians are going to really they will be targeted for avalanche disinformation and blackmail. It's going to go into a different level, a very disturbing different level. Of course, they will be enduring tarnished reputations, manipulation of crucial information, which is going to be seriously distorting public opinion and voting trends. But also women participating in politics will be vulnerable, and especially persecuted and minority communities are going to be targets of algorithm bias and coordinated disinformation agendas by their own parties, by their political opponents, or by the opposition parties. And they'll be subjected to that. There are a couple of examples that I will give you in the Kenyan 2022 general elections. Twitter, women were disproportionately affected by the smear campaigns on Twitter. These are women standing for political offices. And among the women politicians who lost their elections, 72.7% experienced disinformation, 60% faced insults and hate speech, 75% encountered sexual harassment, and 77.4% dealt with trolling. Clearly, that did affect this kind of disinformation online. Violent campaigns, pre-elections did probably affect the voting trends to the extent that they were not able to get the kind of to win the elections, and they did actually affect the voter turnout and voter opinion. The other example is India. I mean, I've been looking at, I mean, there has been several studies. There was one study which is incredibly impressive. It's done by Amnesty International, which has already demonstrated that, Indian women politicians receive nearly twice as much abuse compared to counterparts in UK and US. And recently, all the kind of recent debates on the Indian election are showing that, it's going to be, the upcoming election is going to be a young election and a deep fake election. AI technologies are going to be used by all parties. And so something which happened, I mean, Alka Lamba, remembers the horrors that she's an Indian parliamentarian, and she faced this kind of online smear campaign on Facebook, which had which was only a fake campaign, which she said that, she was part of a prostitution ring. And so the truth was out, and it had very, very serious implications for her political, personality and her political values. So this is not just the deepfake and AI technologies and synthetic media is going to be a very worrying kind of tool or technologies. These are going to be very different, worrying technologies used for women in most parts of the world who are actually running for public office, and this is something serious, which comes to the kind of the follow-up trend, which is and this trend is unhelpful and outdated legal help. So I would say that, my observation is that, women politicians, and this is based on several reports, is that women politicians who are very vocal are actually sometimes, in many countries, subjected to targeted censorships and online surveillance. And this is where still this is a kind of prevalent problems in most countries. That's why we're having internet shutdowns in very many parts of the world, and this is where the legal infrastructures are not very robust, or the policing structures are not very well placed. But overall, this is also part of the kind of developed democracies. Legal systems have not developed at the speed at par with the technological advancement of social media platforms, and so there are for instance, a recent kind of electoral commission, according to the Electoral Commission in the UK, there was the UK is also struggling with laws which were made in 20 years ago or more than 20 years ago, and they haven't kept pace with more ways of campaigning, including things that are more digitally based and deep fake misinformation. So there is a struggle everywhere in the world how to deal with this particular technology, and the legal infrastructure is not at par, or the legal systems are struggling to keep up with the pace with how this synthetic media and information sharing is evolving. So and apart from the kind of more Western democracies, if you see countries which are not so digitally well-resourced and educated, I'll give the example of Bangladesh. So laws on technology facilitated gender-based violence are largely overlooking and not recognizing the word violence. So there is a debate which is going on between lawyers and law enforcement agencies on how to place these cases of online gender based violence, because the question is, do they put, because they already have these two acts, which is the Pornography Control Act, which came in 2012. There is Women and Children Repression Act, which is there since 2000. And then there is a very much debated Cybersecurity Act, which came in 2023. And none of these cases have the capacity, or they don't know how to deal with these cases on online gender-based violence. Yet no law directly addresses this issue or this violence. So there is a whole lot of work that has to be done, which actually also requires legal structures and frameworks to address these issues in a much more of a individual country contextualized manner, but also the capacity building of amongst judges and law enforcement agencies who will have to understand how these technologies work and how can these technologies be located within a cultural discourse, within a cultural political discourse, and which makes me go to the kind of fourth very problematic trend, which is this debate or this discussion has to the problem of online violence against female politicians has to be looked in with cultural sensitivities. And it's fair to ask these questions right now. What kind of democratic cultural discourse is evolving due to this harmful practice and usage of media technologies? And what is the responsibility of the audience or the users? How is this? I mean, why is the practice being enhanced the way that it is? And what kind of democratic cultures are being shaped by these social media platforms, or vice versa? And which countries are affected with this kind of these trends, and to what extent? But most importantly, something which I have not seen much in the debate and in the kind of discussions and the reports by the United Nations and all the kind of fantastic reports which have been done by Commonwealth Parliamentarian Association is also that, countries with heavily patriarchal, unregulated systems, female politicians have a different set of challenges. Often the boundaries between offline and online gets blurred and victims end up facing both. I'll give an example of a Sri Lankan politician, and she said, when I was a local councillor, I used digital spaces to drive social change. It was a time when social
Hi, thank you, Kiran. Just to say, on account of time, we do have a pre-recorded contribution from our third and final panelists. So absolutely, I'm sure there will be some time to address those very final points in our Q&A, if that's okay. But we do need to go to the video now. I believe my colleague will share the pre-recorded contribution from Verizon. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hello everyone, welcome to our presentation as policy. I'm excited to be with you here today and looking forward to sharing with you the work that we've been doing as policy. My name is Sophie Matimba. I'm the Grant and Growth Coordinator at Policy. I'm a feminist and a lawyer by profession, and excited to share with you the work that we've been doing and also insights on how we can make the internet safer for African women. Policy currently runs a number of projects aimed at the feminist internet, access to technology, digital literacy, safety, and social media analytics, with the aim of providing a feminist lens on all these thematic areas. We have a study on online violence against women in 5 countries across Africa. We assess how feminist movements in sub-Saharan Africa use data, and this project is called the Afro-Feminist Data Futures. We also utilize gaming in our programming with the digital safety game, which is an interactive fiction game for women on digital hygiene. We also utilize social media analytics to analyze online violence and gendered disinformation, and this we've done in 2 countries, in Uganda and in Kenya. We also roll out different resources and resource guides, particularly for digital rights as women's rights. And most recently, we've launched a handbook on African women and AI, and it's a research study that studies the impact and gaps, particularly in the African context. The internet has been lauded for providing access to information and freedom of expression, but it also presents issues such as online violence, misinformation, and hate speech. These issues often reflect gender discriminatory tendencies that mirror offline societal structures. As evidence of these challenges that the women are facing on the internet, we have conducted research, particularly in femtech, amplified abuse online, and we've done a research on the experience of women while they use the internet. This research is seen with this quote that you see on the screen. This is from Alternate Realities in Internet, and this research provides evidence of the challenges that women are facing online. Policy and its partners work primarily with women journalists and media practitioners in both legacy and alternative media, and with women leaders, activists, educators, technologists, creatives, and community organizers to co-create solutions for women. We use data and inventive interventions to influence good ICT policies and regulations, shape positive narratives online, and make perpetrators of online violence accountable. All this we do while raising awareness and equipping fellow women with skills and knowledge that they need to design and build platforms that prioritize their safety and privacy. Our aim of the Future of Work project is to advocate for a better digital future. Our vision is to change women's experiences in the digital realm and bridge the digital divide. Our goal is to highlight these issues, co-create solutions, and advocate for a better digital future for women. Policy conducted a study to comprehend the extent and nature of online harassment aimed at political candidates and prominent individuals during Uganda's 2021 and Kenya's 2022 general elections. The goal was to understand how this online harassment could influence their use, expression, and participation in the elections. To this end, we nominated a number of accounts that consisted of candidates, high-profile individuals, and these were monitored on Facebook and Twitter. These two platforms being the most popular public platforms during any campaign or election period. You would be surprised to know that these practices revealed some very interesting insights on the experience of women online. I can pose a question to the audience. Do you think that Facebook and Twitter are capable of picking local languages that are spoken in Kenya and Uganda, particularly in South, that utilize street language and colloquial isms and local language nuances? Machine learning is a method of research that we also as policy have used and continue to use in exploring the challenges of online gender-based violence in public spaces. We developed a machine learning model that is capable of identifying and categorizing instances of online violence and hate speech in both English and Swahili. Remember what I said earlier on about Facebook and Twitter not being able to pick these languages? It's because their systems and the way they are developed are not designed to pick up these local language nuances. But as policy, we managed to develop a language learning models using a classification algorithm that leveraged existing data to detect hate speech in posts and tweets. I will now take you a little bit through our methodology that we used for the Bite Bullies and the Amplified Abuse project, particularly using machine learning to monitor online gender-based violence. Our approach involved a variety of techniques, such as conducting lexicon building, focus group discussions, scraping data from publicly available profiles, and performing qualitative data analysis. Digital technologies have enabled many forms of violence against women in politics to be perpetrated online, across distances and borders without physical contact. This includes threats of death, rape, and beatings, often delivered by anonymous users across various digital platforms. You can imagine a local councillor in Senegal using Twitter to campaign online. You would think that it's another woman behind the keyboard, But mostly as women, because also these spaces are closed, we end up utilizing males to be our social media managers. This then means that they also equally extend the aggression that will be given or directed towards this woman counselor's account. And the next thing you know, she's working in a market and she's a victim of physical gender-based violence. Online gender disinformation is a particularly harmful form of online violence against women in politics. It is designed to delegitimize, demean women's political participation and influence political outcomes. Women aspiring to leadership positions in politics face these various forms of online violence, and they end up not continuing with their political campaigns. Women politicians, particularly in Kenya, were vulnerable to image-based disinformation campaigns. These campaigns manipulated media to sexualize them, create false narratives, and divert attention away from substantive political discourse. This, as you can imagine, resulted in women in politics being presented with a difficult choice. Would they run for political office and face public scrutiny and private attacks, or would they simply refrain from participating? I'm sure you can guess the outcome of this. The incidences of online violence against women in politics, it has increased. And this has been brought with the widespread use of social media. This is a quote again from our other research, which is available on our website. Effective mitigation of online disinformation requires involvement of all interested groups. That is the digital platforms, governments, policymakers, academics, journalists, community organizations, and the wider community of internet users. We also definitely, as policy based off the evidence we collected in our Bite Bullies and Amplified Abuse project, advocate for the contextualization of definitions and local language uptake. What do we mean by this? There needs to be a centralized definition of key terms, or rather a contextualized definition of key terms, most importantly, misinformation and disinformation, as this will be essential to ensuring that authorities dealing with online falsehoods are acting in concert and addressing the same problems. Incorporation of local languages in emerging technology development will assist in curbing misinformation and disinformation. This includes big tech employing local content moderators, having offices in in our local countries, so that we as Africans are able to pick up these problems and have an understanding or better appreciation of context when, let's say, tweets are reported or people complain, and also so that we're actively able to contribute to the community guidelines. Localization is one area that is very important and very key to curbing online violence against women. We also need to amplify our efforts on education. Digital trainings should be embedded in the education curriculum in Africa. It is also important to create platforms for grassroots post-trauma support and networks. It's very important to empower women politicians, activists, journalists, and CSOs to address online harassment in a context-conscious manner and deliberate on priority interventions and determine how best to implement them within their own internal structures and local contexts, while effectively contributing to developing solutions to online harassment. African women need an internet that serves their needs and their discussions. As policy, we are procuring and we continue to procure research on gender data. We have the Afrofeminist Data Manifesto, which is available on our website, and this was launched during our DataFest 2023 edition. As I spoke earlier, we also have the African Women in AI body of work. You're welcome to check out these resources on our website. We are also passionate and also recommend the strengthening of communities of practice, working with journalists, students, women leaders, and government officials to improve gender data practices. You are welcome to check out our Vote Women program, which is aimed at upskilling women politicians to be able to use the internet more efficiently. You're welcome to check out our Future of Work, which is aimed at strengthening journalists and alternative media practitioners. We also have the Digital Ambassadors Program, which particularly works with university students and also teaches them digital literacy and safety. This has been fun, and I would like to thank you all for listening to me. All mentioned resources and more information is available on www.policy.org. You're welcome to check out our Facebook under the name Policy and our Twitter as well. Thank you very much. Asante sana.
Thank you to the contributors from Policy for that. Do see their website for further information about the research and especially the use of machine learning for research into online gender-based violence. I think as we are short of time, perhaps I'll pose one question to both of our speakers, if they are still with us. Thank you. I think one key takeaway for me from all of those contributions was kind of a sense that there might be a limit on the kind of preventative measures that policymakers had or had capacity for, and perhaps more focus should or can only be on the kind of legal aid that you spoke about, that you both mentioned, and support for victims of deepfakes. And I wonder if you could just kind of speak to whether you would say that is a trend and almost sort of a certain direction that this is going for policymakers. Susie, would you
Sure. Yeah.
speak to that? Thank you.
I think right now we are seeing legally a lot of responsiveness towards addressing these things after they've occurred. So when it comes to intimate image sharing, when it comes to online harassment, when it comes to deep fakes, all of these things, like the responses that we're seeing is that once the harm has occurred, we're seeing legal regulation and government response to that. I don't think that that's the way we should move forward entirely. Like, again, with any sort of gender-based violence, it's really important that we react to harms that occur, that we have proper social systems we have civil society organizations, we have victim support organizations to help people once they've been harmed. But really, what we want for these harms to not occur. And so I think some of the most important work that governments can do is funding educational work that changes people's behaviors online and publicly denouncing these types of harms. So governments that take a feminist position, governments that publicly stand up against deepfakes and other forms of image-based abuse and the harassment that Kieran was speaking about. But I do think that if we only focus on post-harm government reaction, that we're not actually getting to the core issues and changing behavior. And we are in a new technological generation where people are still learning what proper social norms are in digital spaces. And I think we have a lot of opportunity to focus on education and shifting social norms that get to the core of ending sexism, ending sexual entitlement towards women's bodies, ending the normalization of rape threats and death threats against female leaders, that I think is probably more important, or at the very least equally important, to addressing post-harm care. But Kieran, I'll pass it back to you. I'm sure you've got some great thoughts.
I think I'm going to really do my conclusion because I did not have the time to do my conclusion, and my conclusion was probably the best.
Thank you.
Voice alive for a female politician in a jungle of social and synthetic media, deepfakes and AI technology is becoming increasingly difficult. Unless we are not going to really look at the issues, we can have layers and layers of laws, regulations, policies. I don't think that, we will then come up with any kind of comprehensive social and legal frameworks. So it is not, my conclusion is the crisis of information will not be for technology or the legal community to solve alone. This will require an inoculation through digital literacy and awareness training, but it will also require proactive, cogent policy responses from the governments, tech companies, civil groups, And it is and only with the full mobilization of society that we will be able to build an overarching resilience to withstand the risks presented by our compromised information ecosystem. We need to talk about, we can't look at these things just in one aspect. We have to look at the online surveillance. We have to look at, we also have to look at how this media misinformation system or information system has evolved over in such a short space of time. So it is a challenge for most governments and the legal communities and the policy networks and the general public itself to actually deal with these issues. Otherwise, I think the legal community is doing fantastic work, as Susie has mentioned, and you know that the other presentation was also incredibly useful. But the technological and the legal aspect are just two parts of this particular very, very complicated machinery. Sorry.
No, thank you very much, Kieran. No, really, really, really interesting. We've actually just had a question from our counterparts who are attending via the CWP conference, if you are happy to just take one last question. This is from Honourable Deputy Speaker Lachisa Sinoli from South Africa, and he's requested whether either of you may know of any model legislation on deepfakes, perhaps any examples from your research that you could provide. Thank you. If you want to go to Susie first, thank you.
Yeah, I don't think there is anything that I would classify as perfectly model legislation. There has been some legislation. I can share in the chat. There's kind of a Canadian Uniform Act for the non-consensual distribution of intimate images that does include deepfakes, and so we've seen examples of that in civil statutes in Canada, here in British Columbia and Nova Scotia or New Brunswick. We see deepfakes included. That trend was really started in Australia, largely by the advocacy work of a woman named Noelle Martin, who'd experienced being a target of deepfakes. So I can post that model legislation and some links to Emily Laidlaw and Hilary Young, who did a lot of research in that, if we're thinking specifically about sexual deepfakes. We've also seen deepfake regulation in the United States. I believe California has both an election deepfake law that suggests you can't post anything to do with deepfakes and elections 30 or 60 days before an election. And they also have, I believe, a civil statute for the prevention of deepfakes. So I can share the statute that I've got, but I think China has some laws on deepfakes right now, but there's really scattered laws. And the one effective tool that we're hoping to see in Canada is to have a fast track content removal possibility. So our BC tribunal, we're going to have like an online website where if your nude images or a deepfake of you has been posted online, you can fill out a really easy online document that'll give you a court order so that you can go to websites and say, legally, you must take this down now. And that's something that a lot of victims of image-based abuse have been calling for, because criminal procedures and regular civil procedures are actually quite long. And ultimately don't take the image down in time to stop the harm. But I'll post some of that information on the chat. And I'm also publishing a paper on deepfakes that'll be coming out in the McGill Law Journal in February that's going to have a large summary. So if you look on my SSRN research page, that should be up in February.
I can only say that, tech companies should be made liable to invest in expensive and extensive deepfake detective technology. They should be held accountable if they refuse to share their customers' data in case of such offenses. We need to have different conversations with tech companies as well. So I think, and that's where the kind of multilateral governmental kind of conversation becomes very, very, very important, because who's going to be watching the watchdog? So that's why a collective kind of multi-governmental response from Commonwealth, Parliamentarian Association or United Nations, a kind of conversation has to be starting with the responsibility that, Twitter, Facebook, Meta, Google, they have to take some aspect of the kind of responsibilities, especially in terms of how they are going to be using the data, and to what extent are they ready to share the data. So there's a lot. It's all in grade. Before we actually start with some very, very serious regulations and regulatory legal reform of the legal infrastructure or legal frameworks, these kind of policy questions should be part of the conversation.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you to both of you, and obviously Vizedo, who isn't here with us. But brilliant, really insightful conversation, and some brilliant case studies, and yeah, a wonderful kind of exploration of these big and often challenging topics. So thank you very much. I'll pass back over to James.
Thanks so much, Charlotte, and I'll echo your thanks to all three speakers, both those that were with us, Susie and Kiran, and also Vizedo for her pre-recorded remarks, all of which I think worked really well together and gave a lot of value. We are now at the closing remarks section of today's schedule. As promised, though, this isn't our usual platitudes and light touch vote of thanks. This is still a substantive part of the programme and actually follows on really nicely, really naturally from the conversation we've just had. And we're really grateful, very, very fortunate to have Sophie Compton joining us to deliver these closing remarks. Sophie is a South by Southwest award-winning and British Independent Film Awards nominated director and producer who tells women's stories of injustice and healing. Her projects have been supported by the Sundance Institute, the International Documentary Association, Impact Partners, Hot Docs, and the Arts Council of England, amongst others. Her debut feature film, Another Body, follows a student's search for justice after discovering deepfake pornography of herself online. It played at South by Southwest, at Hot Docs, at Doc Edge, at the Champs-Elysees, at Munich Festival, at the Aegean Festival, DMZ, Woodstock, Mill Valley, a number of festivals, winning multiple awards. And her second feature, Holloway, which is currently in post-production, follows 6 women returning to the abandoned prison where they were once incarcerated. Previously, she was artistic director of the theatre company Power Play, producing and directing 6 plays, including the award-winning Funeral Flowers and work at the Tate Modern and the V&A. She also runs impact projects around every creative piece, working with grassroots organisations, NGOs, governments, including the White House, members of Parliament, congressmen, and the global press, running campaigns that have gone viral and shaped legislation. And I should say that, at least for those of us in the UK, the debut feature, Another Body, is currently in cinemas. And I know that Sophie is going to talk a little bit more about that film and some wider points around this. So without further ado, I'll shut up and I'll get out of the way and invite Sophie to take the mic. So Sophie, over to you.
Thank you so much, James. I don't think I can share my video as of yet, but I can share. Oh, here, there we go. Okay, hi everybody. Thank you so much for having me. So as James has generously teed up, my film, Another Body, which is where I'm going to start this conversation, start my response to what's already been said, feeds very naturally into the panel that we've just had. I will, in the interest of time, reduce what I'd originally planned to say in certain parts. So hopefully this works smoothly, because lots has already been covered by the brilliant contributions that we've had so far. So I think what I would like to do is to ground some of these important policy conversations in lived experience, and hopefully remind us why we're all here and the kind of lived experience and the emotional reality of some of these abuses that we have been discussing. So some might be very well versed in what's going on and understand the landscape, but I want to share some of my investigative research and dialogue with many survivors of image-based sexual violence. So I'd love to begin by inviting us to imagine what happened to Taylor, who's the subject of the documentary. So a friend sends you a message on Facebook with a link, and the link is to a Pornhub URL. And the message says, "I'm really sorry, but I think you need to see this. You click on the link, and what pops up is your own face looking back at you, depicted in hardcore pornography. You've never acted in porn before, so you have no idea what is going on and why. This is what happened to Taylor, who's a 22-year-old engineering student from the USA. And as she discovers, the videos are, of course, deepfakes. And not only does this Pornhub profile contain all these deepfakes, it also doxes her. It has her hometown, it has her college, it has her personal information. And that is terrifying, devastating, confusing, and the film follows her quest for justice. And if I have screen sharing permissions, I would love to share the trailer for the film as a kind of overview of Taylor's experience. So let me get it up.
I was sitting here with my boyfriend and my face popped up on the screen.
And then it kind of hit me what had actually happened.
Deepfake videos, which are manipulated using AI, can make someone appear as though they're saying or doing something that they're not.
Once these images are online, they never truly go away.
The detective that got assigned to the case, he said that it's disgusting what happened, but the person had a right to do it. Like, they didn't break any laws.
And then they told me they had closed the case.
I kept asking myself, why would someone want to do this, and who would do this?
Okay, all I have to say right now is holy about 20 minutes ago, I found out that I know the other girl who this is happening to.
This is definitely a weird situation that we're in. I'm just more mad that they put my name out there.
So we whittled down the suspects based on who we both knew.
Wait, I know her.
Oh my god, that's Sadie. It's definitely him then. There's no way.
The fact that the group of women is this big, it scares me because I have a gut feeling that we haven't even found all of them.
There is no woman in the world who is safe from this technology.
I'm worried that they're gonna do something more drastic.
You were also targeted by this kid that targeted me.
I'm very tired of ignoring it.
I believe that in his mind, he's getting back at us for wronging him.
I now know his name, where he lives.
I'm angry. You can't just do this and then move on with your life.
So that is the brief overview of Taylor's experience. And something that I find particularly chilling about Taylor's story is that the perpetrator that did this wrote on the site that he used, "Hit me up if you want a good time," impersonating her voice and soliciting people to contact her, who thought that she was that she was a porn actor and that she wanted them to reach out. So I've worked with the incredible Professor Claire McGlynn, who has described deepfake abuse as life-shattering and causing profound social rupture. And I think that this is actually a very accurate description of how this can impact somebody's life. If you imagine not knowing who's created the videos or who've seen them, has your classmates seen them, has your boss seen them, has your friend seen them, a lot of victims find it very hard to trust people around them. In Taylor's case, experiencing this triggered a period of extreme OCD and anxiety. She withdrew, like many people do who are experiencing online abuse, and especially intimate image abuse, withdrew from her social circle because of this fear and this intangibility that online abuse can often have, where you just don't have a grasp of the scale of the problem, and you don't know where it might reappear, and you don't know who might have been part of it or might have seen it. So I think that what I've heard from many, many, many survivors is stories that really reveal the silencing that has been discussed. So I've worked with over 30 survivor leaders through My Image, My Choice, the impact campaign that we created alongside the film to amplify survivor voices. And we worked with them to kind of gather their testimonies and share them with lawmakers, with the World Economic Forum, with the White House, with academics, to make sure that when people are working out how to address this problem, they have access to, really good quality and in-depth lived experience data. So I'd love to share just some of the statements that people have made to me, because I find them really evocative, and I think that they build a picture of what people are experiencing when they've been targeted. So Helen, who's a 34-year-old teacher who was deepfaked, started, the extent to which this impacted her life was so great that she started experiencing panic attacks when she left the house. And she told us, every person I walked past, I thought, have you seen the videos? Lauren, who was targeted by somebody recording a live sexual assault, said that as she was dealing with this, she came to a point where I couldn't think, I couldn't function. I stopped eating for a year, where I felt like if I became smaller, somehow people would notice me less. Chrissy, who is a YouTuber whose private imagery was taken and then shared without her consent, told us that it felt like the image was kind of like ammunition that could be used against me for the rest of my life. And really sadly, she told us that it just became very easy to think about how death would be much easier than living this hell. So I think that, the reason why I wanted to share those quotes with you is because we hear about how online abuse silences women, but it happens in ways that are often very private and contained within people's four walls. So sometimes it can be hard for us to truly grasp the scale of that and truly understand how that affects every corner of someone's life, the minutiae of someone's experience. As we've heard, women who experience online abuse shut down their accounts. They censor what they want to post. They are discouraged from public-facing careers like journalism or politics. And I think what I want to make sure that you are all aware of in terms of the context around deepfakes is that we are at a point in the scale of how this is occurring on the internet, where if you are a particularly well-known politician or a YouTuber or an actor, it's almost certain that you will have been deepfaked. And we just cannot accept the level at which this has become normalized. So Taylor had some interactions with the police, and like many victims of this, the police failed to provide any meaningful support, but actually also compounded the trauma. So unfortunately, she wasn't just dismissed. She was told the person has the right to do this, which was true in the state in the America where she was. But she was also blamed by them and asked questions that were victim blaming. So the detective that she spoke to said, "What did you do to call this upon yourself?" And unfortunately, that type of victim blaming is so common. In fact, out of all of the women that I've spoken to, and all of the women that I've worked with who have experienced this, I haven't spoken to anybody who has had a satisfactory legal response. I have spoken to people that have had really brilliant support from civil society organizations, but nobody has received closure or a pathway to accountability or justice through the law, who I have spoken to personally out of those 30 women. And many, many of them have told me stories of being blamed and disbelieved, or their experience minimized. Why is this such a big deal? It's not even a real image, is a line that happens regularly. And what's so sad about that is how this validates the victim blaming that is coming from the people who are creating deepfakes. And every woman that I've spoken to has had something that they've thought that they felt guilty about, and that they've considered potentially contributed to this abuse that they think was possibly their fault. And as an interlocutor against that, you really all I've been trying to do is to make sure that they know that the violation of their consent is not their fault. So many women who have an online profile say, because I have so much content online, maybe this was inevitable. Or many people say, because I posted slightly risque content, maybe that invited this kind of attention. Taylor felt extremely guilty towards her boyfriend, that she might have done something wrong. So I think that victim blaming narrative is extremely pervasive. And one thing I would like to mention in terms of how successful and good this technology is in relation to, we've had conversations earlier today around, is deepfake technology very persuasive? Is it realistic? Is it believable? Is it uncanny valley? Well, the footage that you saw in the trailer was, all of the footage of Taylor and Julia was deepfaked. And in order to protect her identity, because the film challenges some of the cultures and people and places that are creating this content, and they're known for retaliation. So whilst we tried to make the deepfake as good as possible because it was an important part of our storytelling, we know, and we've seen, we worked with a YouTuber who was self-trained on YouTube and who has a kind of, I would say, pretty high level capacity to deepfake, but not wildly out of the capacity for how this is occurring elsewhere. And so what I wanted to do as well is just to kind of paint a slightly broader picture of the landscape of this abuse, because I think that that's really significant in how we need to legislate this. So in terms of deepfakes, and in terms of many other forms of intimate image or image-based sexual violence, lots of them are occurring on very dedicated sites on the internet. So there are deepfake websites at now which are gaining 14 million hits a month. And in the absence of legislation, creating and trading deepfake pornography has been allowed to develop into not just a growing culture, but a thriving business. This is now a commercial venture. Deepfake creators take commissions, charging as little as $25. I recently saw somebody hiring on one of these forums for an assistant because they are clearly getting a high enough volume of work that they're able to take on, an employee. And I think that some of our conversations have also been about the challenges in legislating this, and there are challenges in legislating this. These websites are often hosted abroad. They're quite difficult. They're not very responsive to public pressure, and they're not very responsive to regulators. So even if you do manage to build a regulatory system, these sites are quite hard to target. However, it's not just the fact that these sites exist, it's the fact that these sites are unbelievably accessible, and their accessibility and their visibility on the internet means that this practice is being normalized. So many people going onto deepfake websites may not even realize or be fully aware that they're engaging in and they're consuming content that is a form of digital sexual abuse. It's been branded and it's considered in school, in classrooms, in university campuses, in boardrooms, in offices, a genre of pornography. But pornography is a consensual activity, and this is not. And so there are really important, we really need to tackle the normalization of this abuse. And one of the main ways that we can do that is to promote tech accountability. Because while these sites are fringe and are possibly hard to shut down, they are hosted by internet service providers, they are accessed via social media companies, they are promoted by search engines, and there's a whole network of kind of an infrastructure around them of very well-established companies that absolutely need to be regulated and brought in line on regulatory systems so that we stop the explosion of this culture. Deepfakes online the number of deepfakes online is doubling every 6 months. So it really is a rate of exponential growth. So One key example that I'd like to share with you is Google. Google does decide to classify some content as harmful, but its decision is completely self-generated. It really is marking its own homework. It can decide what it considers to be harmful and what it doesn't. So it considers animal abuse to be harmful. And if you Google how to make, how to harm my cat, Google will redirect that impulse. It has downranked animal abuse sites, and it has upranked charities which will tell you why you shouldn't do that, and charities giving animal rights information. If you Google how to make deepfake porn of my girlfriend, you will be directed directly to sites which tell you how to do it, tutorials on YouTube, and deepfake websites where you can then share and distribute that content. So those are choices that are being made by Google and by many other companies, Visa, MasterCard, Verizon, PayPal, who are part of this kind of legitimate infrastructure around these very clearly illegitimate sites. So as new laws are being developed, it's so important for us to consider the landscape of how this abuse is occurring in order to meaningfully address it. The other sites that host this content are sites, for example, 4chan or Anon-IB, which are online forums where users can list victims of non-consensual pornography by town, by college, by school. Users trade image of their exes, friends, classmates, asking for, for example, one quote is nudes of her little sister, more of her. And these sites are also hotbeds of misogynistic and racist, homophobic, transphobic, and ableist language. They are the kind of furnace of so much misogyny and so much hate that gets then spread across the internet. And I know this because I've been targeted directly by these sites. Having made this film, we have become a target. And the users on 4chan have been extremely dedicated at trying to find the information of our main contributors who are anonymous. Our contributor GB gets incessant messages from people talking about using extremely derogatory language, using extremely violent language. She's had to, they found her grandmother, they found her address, she's had to change her legal name. The level of abuse is vast, and yet she's received no support. So I know that we don't have time to go into the intricacies of the different approaches to legislation across the world. I'd be very happy to talk in more depth with anybody that would be interested in developing that conversation that was already spoken about in the previous session. But there are a couple of principles that we have identified that feel really important if we are ever to address this. One is that to address the problem of deepfake abuse, we cannot only focus on content authenticity, because these sites do not hide the fact that the content that is shared on them is deepfaked. We also need to frame this as a violence against women issue, and we need to frame it in terms of the principles, the core principles around identity, consent, and the violation of that consent. We need to focus on the infrastructure on the internet that is allowing these communities to grow and gain notoriety, popularity, and respect and normalization. And we need to focus on teaching, education, and survivor support. I think that the best legal scholars, if anybody is interested on this, are Marianne Franks and Daniel Citron in the US, and Claire McGlynn, and also there have been some interesting approaches in South Korea. Because across the globe, legislative measures to address this are falling short. They are not future-proof, and they don't enshrine the kind of core rights that are being violated here, which will mean that we develop a framework that is going to work in the future. So the final remarks that I'd love to share with you all are from the contributor of my film, GB, who is an ASMR artist and YouTuber. who's part of a community that is very heavily targeted by this, and I believe are essentially the kind of canaries in the coal mine of this kind of abuse. And I think illustrates the extent of the victimization and also the extent, the absolute lack of support that she's receiving, which I hope will galvanize everybody's efforts to really do what they can to tackle this in a meaningful way. So GB says, I posted my first video in 2016. In 2016, I also made my first police report because I've received a few hundred too many emails from the same man who told me that he was going to find me. The police were confused, but gave me their card and told me there was nothing they could do unless he showed up. I walked to classes my final year of school terrified, but I kept posting. I did not want to make sexual content, and I spoke openly about how I did not consent to being used sexually. Of course, they did it anyway. And it was easy. And there was nothing that I, the police, the law, or cybersecurity professionals could do. There was nothing the police or the law could do. The gold standard advice was ignore it, because otherwise they might do it more. I was actually contacted by a service who offered to remove these deepfakes of me for $600 a video. And I strongly, and GB, I've spoken to her, strongly suspects that this service was, in cahoots with the people that were making this content. So GB continues, I have always operated under the sick reality that women content creators have to accept that you will be abused. But in meeting Taylor, the subject of the film, she didn't even make that choice. So very soon, it's not just people like me who are being abused. It will be anyone, everyone. I am tired and angry. I feel so protective of the incoming young women and girls who will suffer. And that's what made me finally speak out, because I know I personally am a lost cause. I will always have digitally created porn of me online for my future children to see that will survive long after I'm dead. And then GB finishes by saying that this is why she's decided to use her platform to share her experiences. And I just want, in terms of the silencing, the final thing I would like to say is that she was the very first woman in her community of online content creators to ever speak out publicly about this abuse, which means that every other female content creator was experiencing this in silence. And she told me that was partially because she did not believe anything was going to change. And she gets girls and young women every day asking her, how do I become like you? Should I enter into this profession? And she has to tell them, only do it if you really think that you can accept the level of abuse that you inevitably will receive. So whilst it is a complicated thing to challenge these deep societal constructs, I believe it is absolutely possible to create, to reorient some of the accountability mechanisms that we have against tech platforms, and to, at the very least, end the normalization of these practices, because we cannot leave women like GB behind, disenfranchised and feeling completely unsupported by the society that they live in. Thank you very much.
Sophie, thank you so much for really a really powerful presentation, but also really devastating in many ways. The idea that anyone thinks of themselves as being a lost cause in this space is really, as I say, devastating, but also the individual content creator, GB, that you mentioned, incredibly brave to be the first person to speak out. And I think in terms of, you mentioned reorienting, I think one of the things that we absolutely need to do, it's around language. It's this talk of the bullying, the harassment. It's violence. It's if somebody's saying they want to find you, you've got this, you mentioned there was one individual who said hundreds of times to GB, I'm going to find you. That's violence. And the thought that the police said, no, they need to turn up first before we do something is really, really quite frightening. And I think this lack of future-proof legislation really spoke to the fast following, if it is indeed fast, that Professor Evans spoke about earlier today. But I'm so happy that we had you speak to us, Sophie, and I'm very, very generous of you to offer to continue this conversation with some of those who have joined us today. And I know there are people right across the world who have still stayed up past 10 o'clock at night to listen to you speak on this. And encourage everyone to engage with the film that you've released, Another Body. It's a really innovative approach to storytelling. And I know that's, I think, where a lot of the awards have come from, is this innovative use of synthetic media, and you're one of those using it to try and do some good. So thank you again so much, Sophie, for again really powerful closing remarks.
My pleasure. Thank you for having us. I'll put the link to information about the film in the chat for anyone that's interested.